Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 334. This is the last weekend of January, so of course this is the Patreon Drydock. There's plenty of questions lined up, so let's all sit down, buckle in, grab ourselves a snack and get on with the questions. Brian Stevens asks, as an American who only speaks English, most of my knowledge of great naval leaders are Americans or British. Obviously, thanks to World War II in the Pacific, I also know something of the Japanese leaders, but what would you say are some outstanding leaders outside the last three great naval powers in the time that the channel covers? Well, there's some obvious ones like Admiral Hippe of the Imperial German Navy, Admiral Yi of the Korean Navy if you go back a little bit further, Admiral Togo of the Imperial Japanese Navy at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. But outside of, fairly successful admirals, I think when you look a little bit deeper, there's also a huge amount of outstanding naval leaders who perhaps aren't quite as appreciated as they should be, not because they weren't good, they usually were very good, but more because either the fleets that they were part of didn't necessarily have success, but not due to them. Usually they were in secondary positions of command, and although they were very able officers in themselves, you can point to other things they've done that show this, the overall leadership, for various reasons, wasn't going to take their suggestions on board. So, for example, people I've mentioned a few times, Captain Infernet and Admiral Magon of the French Revolutionary Navy, they both fought at Trafalgar, both very competent officers, actually, and in some ways demonstrating that although turns out decapitating most of your command cadre is a very bad idea generally, there was a rising swell of meritocratic appointments in the French Navy, but in the time between, executing most of the officers or driving them into hiding and the kind of high point of the Napoleonic Wars at sea, there hadn't been quite enough time for them to reach positions of ultimate command, and you still had people who were in place perhaps more because of their ability to parrot revolutionary sentiments than their actual ability to command. And for that matter, poor old Admiral Gravina of the Spanish Navy at Trafalgar was also a very competent naval officer, but placed in an impossible situation where he could see exactly what was going to happen, but had no real ability to influence it because he wasn't in ultimate command. And in some other campaigns, you see a similar thing actually with the Spanish Navy. For example, in the Spanish Armada, Recalde and Oquendo are both incredibly competent sailors, leaders, and commanders. And some of their suggestions, as I covered recently when I was doing the at Times Radio History or History Undone episode on the Armada, if their suggestions had been taken up, the entire Armada campaign could have been flipped on its head. Unfortunately, they were the seconds, not the primary commander, which of course was the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and to be perfectly honest, Medina Sidonia sometimes gets a bit of an unfair rap. Yes, ultimately he did lose, but they was constrained quite a bit by Philip II's orders. So if anyone lost the Armada campaign, it would actually be Philip II, not any of the frontline guys. I mean, if Medina Sidonia had listened to Recalde and Oquendo, he could have won the campaign, but at the same time, if he hadn't been so heavily constrained in his objectives by Philip's commands, he might have listened to them. And of course, if he hadn't been in command and Recalde or Oquendo had been, then things would be very, very different. And of course, as recently covered on this channel, Admiral Rozesvensky, who was, as a few people point out in the comments, if he had been in the Imperial German Navy, the Royal Navy, etc., he probably would have had an absolutely star-studded career. A little bit of a maverick, but you get officers like that in all navies. And he could have led forces to stunning victories, except for the pinnacle of his career was being handed an absolutely impossible task on a plate. And as I said in that video, and I'll say again, the fact that the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron even made it to Tsushima and put up something of a fight is an absolute credit to poor old Rozhesvensky, because the only thing the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron was capable of doing when it left the Baltic was shooting up its own ships. So that's quite a turnaround. Texas and LaShock asks, as impressive a feat as the capture of U-505 was, how significant was the Enigma machine found aboard it? By this point, several had been secured and the U-boat menace was in its waning days, so did it make that much of a difference? Well, it was quite a useful capture in terms of confirming what Allied intelligence was already working out. I mean, obviously you got access to the latest code books, you got access to the latest Enigma machine, so you could check to see if they'd made any updates to it, which, there were occasional updates to it, and some of the non-standard codes that the Germans were using, which you would have more trouble cracking. So it's a good intelligence haul, plus, of course, it's loaded out with the latest German weapons and systems, at least as far as U-boats go, so you can analyze those. The slightly ironic twist on it all was that, at least according to some sources, Admiral King actually wanted initially to court-martial the officers who'd led the capture of U-505 because of the fact that Enigma had already been cracked. His reasoning being that if they just kept on sinking U-boats, the Germans would assume, as they had done up to this point, that the Enigma system was secure. Whereas if it became known to the Germans that U-505 had been captured, which was a possibility considering where it had been captured, and obviously also there could potentially be leaks back in the continental United States, well, then the Germans would go, oh, hang on, they've just captured a submarine. Maybe they have their hands on Enigma. Maybe we should do something about our codes, which would then actually compromise the intelligence that had already been gathered in secret. Luckily for all concerned, including for general fairness, he was persuaded that this was not a particularly wise idea, but it does show you just how twitchy the Allies were over the intel they had already collected. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, part of the reason US production in World War II was so massive was due to its deliberately limiting to a minimum number of viable types, especially with aircraft, tanks, and merchant and warships, especially cruiser size and below. Which nation would have benefited the most from such ruthless rationalisation in its warship building programme? While it's tempting to point at the UK, especially on the smaller end of things, in terms of things like, maybe standardising around the 4.5-inch gun right from the start, to a certain extent, the UK was relatively good outside of guns at standardising, at least in the naval field of things. They didn't try and build heavy cruisers and 3 kinds of light cruiser and, 14 different types of destroyer. Yes, obviously the wartime emergency flotillas did differ slightly from flotilla to flotilla, but it was essentially one design that was just evolving slightly between batches, and they took the full fleet destroyer, which would eventually become the battle class and its subsidiary, the weapon class, sort of offline to deal with separately, and they did the same with full-size cruisers. They kind of just kept going with the Fiji and derivatives, although you could argue that perhaps should have standardized around either the Fiji or just reverted back to standard town class. I think that would have been a good idea. So there are ways of improving for the Royal Navy, but they're not the ones that would benefit the most. Now, you might think the Japanese, but actually the Japanese were, after some initial completion of stuff they'd started before Pearl Harbor, actually pretty good about standardization. You look at the attempts to build massive numbers of Unryu class and the absolutely ruthless pragmatism they had when it came to reducing the amount of fine detail and precious materials found on destroyers and escorts and stuff that they were building. They just didn't have the economy to do a huge amount of mass production, to be perfectly honest. I think the ones that would have benefited the most I mean, they still would have lost, but in terms of their war effort as was actually in practice compared to what they could have done, would have been the Germans. Because the Germans, especially in a naval context, really do not have an excuse. They don't have the time, distance, or size of pre-established fleet that the Japanese have to fall back on. Even before the war, they were running into issues of, we don't have the manpower, we don't have the resources, etc., to complete everything we want. And yet, when you look at what they're building, both in the immediate run-up to and during World War II, they're actually some of the worst offenders when it comes to building multiple classes of things when really they only need the one. Now, obviously, battleship construction is somewhat curtailed, and even cruiser construction is essentially dead. They tried to finish off a few of the hippers, and I mean, even the creep of size and so forth with the hippers is a story in and of itself. But especially when you look at their smaller scale stuff, they keep coming up with new types of destroyer and new types of quote-unquote torpedo boat, which are essentially just small destroyers. And even when it comes to the submarines, there's obviously an understandable need to progress and improve the technology of some submarines, like the Type 7s and Type 9s, the backbone of things. But when you realize that by the end of the war, their submarine design numbers have reached into the 30s, of which various small-scale runs of various examples have been produced on a fair number of those other alternate types, and that's before you get into the small and medium caliber gun issues, you realize that they really, really shot themselves in the foot. If you went back in time and you wanted to improve the Germans' chances, as I said, they're still going to lose, but get them to put in a more creditable performance, then you would want to say, okay, here is a standard destroyer design. Build that. Don't invent half a dozen new destroyer types while you're in the middle of a war. Similarly, here's a standard torpedo boat design. Build that. Don't build 3 or 4 different types there. Smaller escorts, pretty much the same. And when it comes to guns, although there is the larger meta argument about secondary batteries being dual purpose or single purpose or whatever, just to solve a huge number of problems, including top heaviness in German destroyers, really someone should have just turned around and said, we are inventing or accelerating the invention of, or just adapting from the land, from the army, a dual purpose 127, 128mm gun, and that is going to be the gun. You know, everything, secondary batteries for large ships, primary batteries for small ships, that will be the gun. That's what we're using. No arguments. None of this, nonsense about low angle 127mm and low angle 150mm and high angle 105mm and. Oh, and while you're at it, can we please have something in the medium anti-aircraft caliber that doesn't require you to hand reload the thing after every single shot, looking at you, the 37mm. The Rogue Chief asks, in the movie Sink the Bismarck, during the Battle of the Denmark Straits sequence, what is the turret crewman saying as the shells and charges come up the hoist? I've always wondered, since the noise of the scene, the sound quality, the face coverings, and quite likely the accent as well, make it difficult for me to make it out, because, yes, I'm one of those Americans who sometimes need subtitles to understand British television. Don't worry, sometimes even us Brits need subtitles to understand British television if it hasn't been made by people from within the same 30 square mile radius as where we live. And interestingly enough, these sequences were actually filmed on HMS Vanguard, which, although obviously it had slightly modernised turrets, still has 15-inch 42 caliber turrets, so it's about as close as you're ever going to get to seeing Hood reload her guns for real. Now, at the start of the sequence, they say, load the left something. I can't quite make out the last bit because of an increase in background noise. During the actual loading sequence, they repeat 2 phrases each twice. The first phrase they repeat is right gun shell. So that's the gunner saying, essentially, I've loaded a shell in the right-hand gun. And the second one, I'm 99% sure he's saying right gun load half charge. Now, he could be saying something slightly different where I think he's saying half. He definitely says right gun load something charge, and I think it's half charge. And I think that's partly supported by the fact you see the rammer actually send a couple of charges in. So I think what the gunner is doing in that sequence is he's actually reporting the stages at which the ship is, or his gun is at least, in the loading process. Now, of course, you're not going to load the right gun with shell twice. They've repeated some of the footage. So it's also possible that he's saying something, as I said, other than half. That bit's a little less clear to me. But the general gist of it, I think, is that he's reporting as the shell and charges are being loaded into the gun. Andrew Kirschman asks, would the World War II German capital ships have been more useful if they'd been coal-fired? It's certainly an interesting question, but ultimately I think probably not, on a few grounds. Firstly, of course, is endurance, and that actually splits into two sections. Firstly, of course, we know Germany mostly has access to awful coal, so they would have suffered similar problems to that which the high seas fleet suffered of, after you sail at high speed for a day or so, you're basically reduced to about half speed while you try and clear out all the horrible muck that's built up in your boilers. And the other element to that is that obviously, especially for the German capital ships, the Scharnhorst and the Bismarcks, if you want to move at full clip, you're going to be burning an awful lot of fuel, which means your stokers are going to get incredibly tired incredibly quickly, as opposed to the amount of fuel you need to move the smaller World War I German capital ships at a somewhat slower speed. And then you've got other issues like the fact that if you're going to reintroduce coal stokers, that means you're massively increasing the crew size of the ships. And, well, German capital ships weren't exactly low manning ships in the first place. Now, you could argue there is a little bit of a fine line that you could potentially walk, because ultimately, yes, there are all these disadvantages to coal-fired versus oil-fired, but if you don't have the oil fuel, you're not going anywhere at all. So you could potentially argue that Germany could stockpile good quality coal in the interwar period and use its, relatively speaking, small reserves of good quality coal for its capital ships, either, well, not necessarily instead of, but taking some away from industry, because obviously you've only got a few compared to the massive numbers of ships in the high seas fleet. And if you then invested in some kind of automated crushing and feeding system, you could address some of the crew requirements, both in terms of minimizing the number of extra stokers you'd need and in terms of reducing the fatigue factor involved. And that would then allow you to operate your capital ships for longer because you would have better access to said fuel. The flip side of all of that, of course, is still you're going to end up with something with a lower energy density. And even if you go with combined coal and oil spraying, there is still going to be serious questions over whether or not you can actually reach the speeds that you want. And of course, if your ships are slower, they're easier to catch. Alex Moskowitz asks, how did the implementation of the cure for scurvy affect recruitment in the Royal Navy? At this stage, I'm not particularly aware of a specific study that's been done to see how much the cure for scurvy affected recruitment in the Navy. I suspect someone's probably looked into it because the effects of scurvy have been studied a fair bit. But in terms of overall effects, I anticipate or suspect it would have had a somewhat beneficial effect on recruitment, because obviously there are lots of things you can die of at sea: disease, enemy action, accidents, etc. But scurvy was a known killer to the point that any long-distance voyage overstocked its ships with crew because they just assumed that a certain percentage of them were going to die. If you're now confronted with the fact that that's not going to happen, ideally, and therefore your potential causes of death at sea are somewhat more limited, that, of course, increases the overall attraction of a career in the Royal Navy, especially when you consider that, yes, you still have all those other potential ways of dying, but it's not exactly like there weren't a lot of interesting and horrible ways of dying or starving to death or whatever on land anyway at that point in history. And of course, the fact that the Royal Navy could retain more sailors simply because, if you join the Royal Navy and you want to do it as a career and then you die of scurvy, the Royal Navy has to replace you. If you now don't die of scurvy, the Royal Navy doesn't have to replace you, which means further recruitment only has to look at supplementing you and your mates and, replacing up casualties from other causes rather than just, we're sending this ship out with 800 men. We'll get about 500 of them back if we're lucky, and then we'll just have to find another 300, which was kind of a default for a large ship if in the times when scurvy didn't have a cure. And I think in particular it would have made ships commissioning for long voyages, particularly commerce raiding voyages, such as, particularly frigates, some third rates as well, much, much more attractive because obviously if you go off on a long voyage for months and months and months at sea trying to hunt down enemy commerce, that's a prime target for being hit by scurvy, even though there is the potential of lots of prize money, whereas once the cure for scurvy has been discovered, well, now there's just potential for lots of prize money and a little bit of gunfire. Rebel Skverl asks, in the 20th century specifically, how extensively were overseas Royal Navy bases such as Gibraltar, Malta, Alexandria, Port Said, Singapore, etc., built up in comparison with bases in the UK proper? Well, it depends a lot on what base you're looking at in the UK, because within the UK you had some naval bases such as, say, Portsmouth, which had been important in the 19th century and before and would continue to be important into the 20th century. You had other bases like, for example, Devonport, which had been incredibly important and for training purposes still was, but as far as being an active naval base, ship construction, ship maintenance, ship basing, was perhaps a little bit on the decline compared to its heyday. And then, of course, you had other bases like Scapa Flow, which in the 19th century nobody cared about, there was nothing there, but were now becoming much more important because of mining and submarines and so forth. And to a certain extent, you had a similar situation going on with overseas bases, some of which were declining in importance, some of which were increasing in importance, and others were pretty much staying as they had been for quite a while. Gibraltar and Malta, for example, were linchpins of Royal Navy strategy and were continuously being upgraded. So you can see here, this is the view from the top of the Rock of Gibraltar down into the southern part of the harbour area of Gibraltar. And you can see there some of the dry dock spaces that were established at that time. The furthest dry dock space that you can see, the one that's closest to the sea, that is the one that actually dominated size considerations both for Hood and for the G3s, which obviously were going to succeed Hood, because this was a fairly large dry dock. It could take most battleships and battle cruisers, but it obviously had a finite length. And one of the considerations was, well, if we're going to be sending these battle cruisers around the world, they need to be able to fit into dry docks that can be repaired around the world. So that's just a little bit of an interesting side bit. So most overseas bases did not have shipbuilding capabilities because the infrastructure that you require to actually be able to construct a ship is far more complicated than just a harbour. But a lot of them would have fairly complex repair facilities. Gibraltar obviously had quite a lot of maintenance and repair facilities, probably well beyond most bases in the UK, albeit not all. Malta, likewise, had a huge amount of repair capability and maintenance capability, again, much beyond what you'd find in most UK bases. Alexandria, less so. Alexandria had some basing capacity, but not a huge amount of maintenance and repair, because essentially it was just seen as a watchkeeper position for the Suez Canal. Malta was the linchpin of the Mediterranean fleet right up until the start of World War II, when it suddenly became very obvious that it wasn't, and that was one of the struggles that Cunningham had with Alexandria, trying to essentially bring it up to a standard where it could support the Mediterranean fleet. Fortunately, by that point, things like floating dry docks could help to mitigate those issues somewhat. Singapore is an interesting one because Singapore initially had a huge amount of capability that capability was supposed to be built up even further, to the point that Singapore probably would have been the single most capable dry dock, maintenance, repair, etc., facility in the British Empire, outside of maybe somewhere like Portsmouth or Southampton. But certain restrictions, as well as both financial and treaty-wise, meant that that policy wasn't entirely followed through by the time of World War II, which you could argue is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on if you think the extra upgrades it was supposed to get would have helped it stop the Japanese. So the absolute most important bases, like I said, Gibraltar, Malta, and Singapore particularly, they would usually have facilities that were on a par with what you might say is the upper third of facilities back in the UK. Lesser facilities would obviously scale down from that and might be all the way down to just a glorified coaling or oiling station, depending on what point in the 20th century you're looking at. DM Phoenix asks, you, Drac, have just been promoted to First Sea Lord, or Dreadnought Pope, and tasked with arbitrarily defining a new type of warship called a light battleship, a BL or BBL, as something separate from heavy cruisers, battle cruisers, and conventional battleships. What criteria would you set, and which actual existing warships would you include or not include in such a classification? Well, if I'm going to define a light battleship, then I'd look at how I would define a normal battleship, which is, generally speaking, to me at least, a ship that is primarily designed to fight other peer vessels in a line of battle. It is primarily armed with heavy artillery greater than 11 or 12 inches. It carries extensive protection against all known threats for at least the time period that it's built in. And it has armour that, roughly speaking, should protect it from either its own guns or very similar enemy guns at whatever the Navy expects its reasonable battle range to be. Oh, and in the design process, you're supposed to prioritise firepower and protection over speed. Now, if you're trying to come up with a light battleship, well, this suggests that the displacement of said battleship is going to be less than the typical displacement for contemporary or peer battleships. So that would be the first qualification. It would be a displacement substantially less than the average for the time period in which it is being constructed. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that if you start to diminish displacement, you diminish what you can put on a ship. And if you consider your three basics, speed, protection, and firepower, what can you reduce and still call it a battleship? Well, you can't really reduce speed all that much. In fact, because it's smaller and therefore potentially at a disadvantage against full-size battleships, you might even want it to be a little bit faster than average, albeit not fully dedicated to speed, because then you're creating a battle cruiser. Then you look at protection. Well, you can possibly minimize protection somewhat, but you still, again, have to have at least enough protection to give you a chance in a battle line, as opposed to going down to protection that will only protect you against cruisers and super cruisers, because again, at that point you've invented a battle cruiser. So you still have to have a substantial amount of protection for period weapons that you might be expecting to face off against in capital ship terms. And so that means that while you might have a small reduction in protection, you probably are going to make up for that gain in weight, in available weight, by having more machinery, which means that your firepower is probably going to go down, at which point that would be my new definition. So you can probably take or leave speed, but essentially speed would not drop below contemporary capital ships. Protection possibly would reduce, but still needs to be within an area where it can defend you at some ranges against capital ship firepower. But the firepower might drop from the average, either in terms of numbers of barrels. So let's say your average is 15 or 16 inch. If everyone's taking 8 or 9 guns, then a 6-gun ship with, say, 6 15-inch guns might meet the criteria of a light battleship. Or if you want to keep 8 or 9 guns, you might drop the caliber, but you still have to stay in that capital ship range of 11 inches plus. that would be my set of qualifications, at which point the Scharnhorsts definitely fit because they've got the speed, they've got the protection, and they're essentially paying for their lesser displacement by having 1111s instead of twin 15s. The Alaskas I wouldn't include because they don't have the protection. Particularly would note the protection against all aspects of threat. They really do not have all that much torpedo protection. A battleship built in the 1940s does need to have torpedo protection, and a lot of it. The Courageouses, definitely not, because they essentially are made of paper. The Dunkirks, well, again, I come back to my personal view that Dunkirk and Strasbourg basically split the difference between what is a small battleship and what is a battlecruiser. Dunkirk, personally, I would define as a form of battlecruiser, simply because she doesn't carry the armour protection to be able to go toe-to-toe with the average battleship that is in existence at the time of her construction. And she is fast, and she's fairly well armed, but she's just a little bit lacking the protection department. Whereas Strasbourg, by adding that bit more armour, just about enters the realm of having enough protection to stand in a battle line against at least a reasonable number of expected opponents, and therefore she would be a light battleship under this definition. Nicholas Ressar asks, on the USS Nevada, the twin and triple turrets look like they're close to the same size. Why? Was the triple turret cramped or the twin exceptionally large? Well, as you can see here, they certainly look to be extremely similar, although if you look into the extremely fine detail, it turns out that the barbette inner diameter of the triple turrets is 30 feet and the twin turrets are 28 feet, so it's only a 2-foot difference. And the triple turret's supposed to carry slightly more armour than the twins as well. So yes, they are different, but at the same time, they are very close to the same size. And I suspect in part that was to allow the use of probably similar castings, or possibly even the same castings for certain elements of the turret face and sides and back and so forth, just trimmed a little bit here and there. And as you can probably tell from the spacing of the guns, that would have meant that, yes, the twin turret would have been a slightly roomier affair than the triple. Clayton Bradish asks, it seems that the tale of the epic battle of Lake Tanganyika and its colourful history will not get a standalone video, so could you go over it quickly in the Drydock? Well, never say never. Just because it hasn't been voted at the top of the Patreon results doesn't necessarily mean it's not on the list. It just means it might take a bit longer to do. But in brief, there's not one battle of Lake Tanganyika, there's several battles for it. But the whole setup is quite interesting, because Lake Tanganyika sat at the time mostly between German and Belgian-held territories in Africa, but the southern tip of it intruded into British-held territory. Initially, therefore, the primary conflict was between the Belgians and the Germans had the better of that, mostly because they actually had a couple of tiny ships they'd armed with a few guns, whereas the Belgians didn't. And before the Belgians could get round to arming up their own ships, the Germans showed up and sank anything of any substantial size that they thought might be armed. The British then donated some guns to the Belgians. The Belgians were like, great, fantastic. However, although we do have another ship in bits that we could assemble and arm, which would be the biggest and meanest ship on the lake at that point, well, I'll use the term ship loosely because, as you can see here, none of these vessels are particularly big. They realised that if they started building the ship, the Germans would probably rock up and blow it up. So shades of the Great Lakes element of the War of 1812 going on here. The British then decided they were going to have to get involved a bit more directly, and you ended up with a rather eccentric British naval officer being dragged out of London and being told, right, here's a couple of small gunboats we were building for the Greeks. They're small enough critically to be moved overland whole, so can be launched straight into the lake without having to be reconstructed, and thus giving the Germans time to attack them. And you're going to take those and you're going to fight the Germans for control of the lake. And, you know, being an eccentric British naval officer, he said, right, I want to name them HMS Cat and HMS Dog. The Admiralty basically told him, no, don't be stupid. So he came up with Mimi and Fufu. And for some reason, the Admiralty went, this looks weird and foreign. Okay, fine, we're not going to bother looking into this further. And in fact, it essentially means, in slang, as far as most Parisian slang, is something along the lines of meow and bow wow. So essentially they're cat and dog under slightly different spelling. And he then began a campaign against the Germans that actually worked fairly well, because even though you now had 2 armed motor vessels on the lakes, technically the Germans had 3, so they had a numbers advantage. At least 2 of the German ships were slightly faster, and one of them, the Graf Gürzen, was considerably larger and happened to have a cruiser-grade gun on board as well, a 4.1 inch. But not realising quite what the British vessels were capable of, the Germans unintentionally allowed themselves to be eaten away one by one. So one of their ships got ambushed and eventually disabled and captured by the British, who then, again, Shades of the War of 1812 Great Lakes edition, added it to their own fleet. They then went after yet another one of the German ships. That one was sunk, and that left the Graf Gürzen, the only one armed German ship left, now heavily outnumbered, because not only did the British have Mimi and Fufu and now Fifi, which that was the renamed captured German ship, they'd also used the fact that they now had de facto control of the lakes to complete and arm a number of other Belgian and British ships, either ones that were available somewhere on Tanganyika already, or in the case of 1 or 2, actually dismantled from nearby lakes and rivers and dragged over and reassembled. So now they had quite the flotilla, plus the land war was starting to look like it was going badly for the Germans, so they scuttled the Graf Gürzen and made off with her armament, which gave the British and the Belgians control of Lake Tanganyika. Albeit that, again, as you can guess from the size of these ships, this was very much the kind of naval engagement where 1 or 2 hits could completely total a ship, and just because you had surface control, which was quite useful because it meant you could run supplies and men up and down the lake much, much faster than they could walk around the edge of it, or you could cross the lake, it didn't give you absolute control of everything because, again, these vessels are incredibly vulnerable, so occasionally well dug in shore batteries could dominate that small section of the lake, because although these small boats could engage those shore guns, they would almost certainly lose a fight with them. Marlin Stout asks, we see in pictures from armour tests that even if a shell doesn't penetrate the armour, it will damage it, perhaps leaving a crater and or cracks in the surface. If another shell hits a spot or near a spot that's already been damaged by a non-penetrating hit, is it more likely to penetrate, even if it's also perhaps too small a shell to normally penetrate the armour? And if so, do you know of any times that this sort of thing has actually happened in battle? It's not just something a captain could plan on, but a lucky hit like that could potentially happen by random chance. If I recall correctly, there were some cases in the early ironclad period where, of course, armour was a little bit more questionable, and there were still quite a lot of ships equipped with broadside batteries, i.e. lots of guns, where cumulative damage caused either a plate failure completely, as in a plate or some other form of armouring just falling off, or a partial failure, such as multiple layers of plate where perhaps some of the outer layers were spalled off, and then obviously a shell could go through the smaller number of remaining layers, or a bunch of hits in close proximity would cause one of those hits to go through. I can't recall any specific examples offhand, but I do recall that something like that did happen back then. In terms of the later ironclad and then steel era, and going into the 20th century, I don't believe anything like that happened in that period. More than anything, it's a combination of the ships getting longer, so therefore there being a statistically greater amount of surface area to hit, and therefore statistically any individual hit being in exactly the same spot is fairly unlikely. And on top of that, you have the fact that obviously gun numbers reduce quite significantly. So instead of having several dozen guns firing at close range every minute or so, you only have 8 well, in the pre-Dreadnought era, 4, but then maybe 8 or 9 guns, maybe a few more if you're counting secondaries, and therefore even if the ships were exactly the same size, the odds of 2 shells from this relatively small number of incoming shells hitting in the same place is pretty minimal. In theory, if we were looking at it in the abstract, you could potentially get a non-penetrating hit and then a follow-up hit either on the same spot or very close to it, which could then punch through. But it would depend very much on the scale of the hit. So if you're talking about, say, a battleship with 12, 13, 14 inches of armour, if you fling a 5-inch shell at it and then another 5-inch shell on the same spot, it's not going to do anything. Whereas if you had that same armour and you perhaps hit it, let's say you had a 15-inch belt and you hit it with a 12-inch shell at 18,000 yards, very unlikely to go through. In fact, pretty much impossible, assuming you're talking about normal, good quality steel armour with a face hardening. But a shell of that size might do enough damage to the outer face, the hardened part of the armour, that a strike in the same place or immediately adjacent to it might then have a much easier time of either penetrating what's left of the hardened face in that area or just bypassing it entirely, and either way expending most of its energy in the softer backing plate, which will give way a lot more easily and therefore might ensure a penetration, especially if, of course, that first hit perhaps blew away all of the hardened face and part of the backing as well. ACC asks, in cleaning out my parents' basement this holiday, I came across this memory from the 1990s. It's a generic, definitely not Lego warship, and is generically named Battleship with a hull number of 1780. Based on armament and the size of the helipad, I assume it's actually a late war, post-war refit US cruiser of some variety. I was wondering if you could take a stab at identifying on which class or ship this oh-so-generic model was based. Well, it's, I don't think it's based on anything in particular. It's certainly not based on any capital ship. The proportions are all wrong, which isn't exactly surprising, so the hull number's far too high. There are a few things that vaguely put me in the mind of a large corvette or a small destroyer from the Cold War period. Specifically the 6 twin guns, which could be a legacy holdover from either late World War II or early Cold War ships. And then, of course, you can see it's been also got this essentially multiple rocket launcher, whether that's a missile launcher or rocket launcher, probably would depend on whether it's a corvette, patrol ship or destroyer. And then what's quite clearly some chaff launchers either side just after the superstructure. Now, with all that said, the combination of some kind of missile launcher amidships, then a small helipad, and 6 guns in 3 twin mounts, 2 superfiring forward and 1 aft, is actually a relatively rare thing, and the only 2 types of ship that really come to mind are either the Halland class Swedish destroyers after their refit, or the Fram 2 conversions of the gearings. Now, if you look at either of those, you'll see that they only bear a passing resemblance to this thing, but they're also the only things that have that combination, as far as I'm aware, of 3 twin guns, a helipad forward of the aft gun, and some kind of missile launcher, roughly speaking, amidships. Chief Eyeroll asks, following up to the Western Squadron staff manning in Drydock 325 Part 1, you mentioned Sir Edward Hawke's command implementing a system of replenishment at sea for the vessels of the blockading squadron. What were the components and procedures of Hawke's system that were particularly groundbreaking, or at least notable? Was this system implemented fleet-wide, or was it a system unique to the circumstances of that squadron? The main component of the system was the fact that it was happening at all at sea. So previously, if you wanted to keep your ships on station, you either had to have enough ships that you could maintain a creditable blockade with, let's say, for sake of argument, 3/4 of your forces there, and then you would rotate. So let's say if you have 32 ships, because that divides down nice and easily. So you would then send 8 ships home, and whichever ones were the shortest on supply. So they would rest, resupply, etc., while your other 24 ships stayed out on station. And then they'd come back, and then the next 8 ships would go, and then the next, and so on and so forth. So you'd only ever have 24 ships on station, except for very brief periods of time. But you could keep a rolling blockade up. But of course, that meant you had to commit 30 ships to a station, or 32 ships, I should say, to a station where you only would ever have really 24 capable of fighting. And some of them would be on the verge of running out of supplies at any given time. The other alternative, which occasionally had been done, but not on a really organised basis, but more ad hoc, would be for a fleet to leave its station entirely and seek a nearby safe harbour and replenish from supplies that had been sent over there. That could be done in some places, but obviously not off the coast of France. So what Hawke did is, as well as doing shuttle runs with a few ships in his command, because that was just a generic thing that was done normally, he instituted the sending of either several smaller, what they would call victualling, i.e. supply ships, or 1 or 2 considerably larger ships, depending on what was available in port at the time. And these would be then escorted to the blockading fleet if there were no major warships in need of heading out, by smaller ships, so frigates and so maybe small ships of the line. And if there were a few ships either being assigned to the blockade or coming back to the blockade, they would accompany the victualling ships out. And then once they got there, then the victualling ship would sail up to the various ships on blockade, come alongside, and then there would be an exchange of everything from beer to dried beef to vegetables to, spare bits of wood, spare sails and pulley blocks, and even livestock being craned across. Obviously, you did have to wait for a certain degree of calm weather to do this, but it was surprisingly advanced given the time period. And then when they headed back, obviously they'd be empty, so they'd be less tempting targets, but ideally either the escort that brought them out would go home with them, or if there was a ship that was being detached back home for whatever reason, then it would go with them as well to keep them secure. And this essentially allowed Hawke to have the vast majority of his fleet sitting happily stocked and supplied on blockade duty essentially indefinitely, or until the ships themselves wore out. Was it implemented fleet-wide? Not completely. The system as a whole was noted and then kept in reserve as a way of maintaining a close blockade when circumstances allowed. So you would see this system picked up and continued for later blockades of the French coast. But it also depended on having enough warships for the escort of the victualling ships, and having the victualling ships themselves able to gather the supplies and sail across and everything. So it was a necessarily, relatively speaking, close range operation. So again, for blockading the French coast, perfectly fine. For blockading the, let's say, Spanish coast or the American coast, not quite as practical because of the distances involved between a port which could reasonably have enough merchant ships to keep the supply runs going, and where the blockade was. So, for example, in the War of 1812, there were lots of individual blockades scattered all over the American East Coast rather than one big blockading fleet. So, in that case, the older system of sending individual ships off to rest and resupply was adopted. And, for example, when Nelson was blockading the Franco-Spanish fleet down in Cadiz in the run-up to the Battle of Trafalgar, while the occasional supply ship might show up from Gibraltar, it was more, again, a case of sending ships into Gibraltar to restock and resupply, and then for them to come back. And indeed, some of his fleet was actually off doing that when the Battle of Trafalgar took place. So it was, given the limitations of sail at the time, something of a unique system to if you happened to be the UK and you wanted to blockade the north or western French coastlines. Nick Brodar asks, following Mers-El-Kebir, the surviving Vichy ships set out in pursuit of the British fleet but were called back prior to catching them. What would have happened had the pursuit continued and the French engaged the British? Well, that's not exactly what happened. The Strasbourg and 3 destroyers made a run for Toulon, and they were supposed to meet up with the 6 La Galissonière class light cruisers, one of which you can see here, which had been based in Algiers and had been summoned to Mers-El-Kebir to try and back up the forces at Mers-El-Kebir, but hadn't arrived in time. And the British forces were in pursuit of Strasbourg and her 3 escorting destroyers. Hood, of course, outpacing everybody else, was gradually closing on Strasbourg, but the Admiralty misidentified the force coming from Algiers, thinking it was 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and a bunch of destroyers, which was pretty much physically impossible because there weren't that many French heavy cruisers unaccounted for, but there you go. In any case, Somerville realised that Hood and a handful of small ships on its own against Strasbourg and, in theory, 8 cruisers and a whole bunch of destroyers would be a little bit outnumbered, so he decided to break off the pursuit. If he decided to continue the pursuit, then it would have been Strasbourg, 3 destroyers and 6 light cruisers versus Hood and whatever escort she had with her. Now, of course, if Somerville sees those cruisers coming over the horizon, which he almost certainly will, he's not going to be dumb enough to try and make that his fight. So he would do what he did historically when he thought he wasn't going to catch Strasbourg in time, which is to fall back on the rest of Force H, which is Resolution, Ark Royal, and Valiant for capital ships. And then you've got Arethusa and Enterprise, 2 light cruisers, and then a whole ton of destroyers. Now, if that entire force had come up against the entire French force, so if the French had then turned around and decided to chase Hood, in reality, the cruisers never actually managed to rendezvous with Strasbourg, but let's assume that they did, and they decided they were going to go and try and get some revenge, then it would be a relatively interesting fight. Of course, the British would, at that point, the only ones with air support, because Ark Royal can launch its Swordfish. The British have a significant numerical advantage in destroyers, but with the best one in the world, Arethusa and Enterprise are, on at least on paper, and almost certainly in practice, also not even a matchup 1v1 for La Galissonière. Assuming they're both crewed at about the same level, La Galissonière is far superior to either one of those ships. But, of course, the French only have 1 capital ship, Strasbourg. The British have 3 battleships, and Valiant is newly refitted with her radar and 4.5-inch secondaries and so on and so forth. So how would that break down? Well, as I say, the British destroyers can pretty much no-sell and deal with the French destroyers pretty easily and with ships to spare. So they could be making attack runs on either Strasbourg or the cruisers, or potentially both, with torpedoes. Now, you are going to have Swordfish potentially tipping the balance, so you're going to have the French larger ships, the cruisers and Strasbourg, under repeated torpedo attack from air and sea. So that's going to disrupt any efforts for them to form a battle line or concentrate on any British ships they might have been able to damage. And I would be tempted, if I was the British, to put Arethusa and Enterprise in with the destroyers to give them even more overwhelming firepower against the French destroyers, of which there are only 3, and also to obviously protect the destroyers somewhat against interference from the La Galissonières, and to, keep my cruisers a little bit away from Strasbourg. And then you have the fact that, well, let's say Strasbourg and Valiant, or Strasbourg and Hood, the British ships have a firepower advantage. Strasbourg is more modern, but let's say one of those 2 British ships effectively will cancel out Strasbourg, so they'll kind of be fighting each other. Of course, there would be an instinct, I think, with Somerville to try and get 2 or 3 ships to fire on Strasbourg, but Strasbourg is fast enough that she could choose to engage which British ship she wanted to, obviously still coming under air attack from Ark Royal. So let's say Hood and Strasbourg are fencing each other. That leaves 6 La Galissonières against whatever of the British destroyer and cruiser forces can be spared from murdering the French destroyers, and 2 full-scale battleships. If the French ships can get close enough to start dumping torpedoes in the water, it could get a bit problematic. But on the other hand, well, We saw how long 3 Italian heavy cruisers lasted against a trio of British ships manning 15-inch guns. And if you've got torpedoes in the water and torpedoes from Swordfish and 15-inch guns from both Valiant and Resolution, it would take a very courageous French commander or admiral to keep his attack going when he'd probably be having ships being crippled and blown up left, right and centre all around him. So the most likely option is a mixture of British light forces plus 2 full battleships would maul the La Galissonière enough to make them fall back, at which point Strasbourg would face the problem of, well, it can either keep fighting Hood, probably both sides have taken some damage. Of course, if the other 2 battleships are now able to, and or Ark Royal's full attention can now turn on Strasbourg, Strasbourg's doomed. So Strasbourg probably would also try and make a run for it, assuming she hasn't received, engine damage or significant flooding. Of course, Hood, as I said, probably would be damaged as well. The chances of her going up, Denmark Straits style are fairly slim. It's a very, very unfortunate and 1 in a million shot there. But you could have all sorts of variants. So that's probably the average scenario. But as I said, you can have variants on that scenario where perhaps Somerville gets caught out of place with just Hood and a few destroyers, or Strasbourg manages to work its way around General Melee to try and take pot shots at Ark Royal, or the Strasbourg slightly takes a misstep and faces a barrage from 3 British capital ships and gets crippled almost instantly, and everything in between. Mr. Fechler, and with the many, many, many names, unfortunately, I don't currently have access to Patreon while I'm recording this, so you know who you are. Anyway, he asks, I noticed that a lot of publications and books that predate Hunley's rediscovery depict the submarine wrong, with most depicting her with design errors such as a conical bow, a strange conning tower, or odd spar mounts. Some even shamelessly use depictions of other ships that look similar, such as Plunger or Intelligent Whale. Was there ever some conjecture on Hunley's shape or design, or is this just a case of ignorant or lazy publishers? Well, the slightly odd thing about it all is that there always was a fairly accurate depiction of Hunley out there right from the time of the American Civil War. This one, which was then redone as a different painting and also a couple of sketch plans in the early 1900s. But if you look at the Hunley as she is now and this picture, it's pretty much the same. What seems to have been the problem, however, is that also around the time that Hunley was developed, there were a few actual sketches, as very crude, but sketch plans ostensibly being of Hunley made and circulated. And of course, people latch onto, oh, well, this is a plan, no matter how crude, as opposed to this is a painting and therefore may be, in people's minds, subject to artist interpretation. And that sketch was a very crude looking vessel, which seems to be the origin of most of the misrepresentations where people haven't just given up entirely and gone off to depict their own thing. And I think that's partly drawn out because of this, this full sketch that's been circulating pretty much since she was constructed, but combined with the fact that, of course, she was lost and thought to be completely lost for a very, very long time. Plus, of course, it was the Confederate Navy, not a huge amount of precise and detailed records kept and survived about her construction. And so people just kind of went with roughly what they thought might be vaguely accurate based on information that they had, while, hilariously enough, actually, most of them ignoring this relatively accurate painting that was always there. And to a certain extent, I think potentially even now that false idea of Hunley as essentially just this big tube with a point on one end has almost entered people's consciousness so much that it's become a default that people reflexively go to without even bothering to check if it's real, because of course it's real. That's what they've seen all the time. Whereas, as I said, if you look at the Hunley as she is now, after a good amount of preservation, she looks surprisingly advanced for a submarine designed in the 1860s. Robert Henry Ilston asks, how was damage control conducted or trained for in the early days of the electrification of capital ships? While the engineers may have understood the danger, most of the sailors probably didn't, seeing as how electrical gadgets and electricity itself wasn't that common in many Victorian homes? Well, there wasn't a huge amount of formal damage control training in the way that you would think of it in the 20th century, in the 1870s and 1880s, when you had early electrification of capital ships. There was, of course, things like, close up the bulkheads and so forth, which in and of itself was a relatively new concept. But to be perfectly honest, in the very early days of electrification, aside from telling sailors, this is a cable, if it's going spark, 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 don't touch it, you probably didn't need to worry too much, because if a ship was hit badly enough to actually need live damage control parties that didn't involve some kind of engineer or senior officer who knew what the potential dangers might be, the ship had probably at that point taken so much damage to the electrical system and its generator were probably dead anyway, so it probably didn't matter too much. And ultimately, you also have the fact that at least once people got out of the brief phase of let's run 800-volt open carbon arc lamps in a moist, damp environment such as an engine room, while the remaining voltages and currents wouldn't exactly be pleasant, you were ultimately on an iron or steel ship. So if everything in that vicinity had been blown to pieces by a shell hit, one, things were probably on fire, and that would be the more dangerous threat. And two, if when the fire was out, or potentially ran the risk of pumping water over an exposed electrical connection, you were standing on a giant Faraday cage that would, unless you were extremely unlucky, conduct the electricity away and into the sea around you. That's not to say there would be the potential for problems, but the number of early electrified ships that also saw combat, and so anyone actually ever had to test this out, was vanishingly slim. And by the time ships really started laying into each other towards the end of the 19th century, yes, there was a lot more electrification, but by that point, most people had been generally trained up in the dangers of it as well. Greg M. asks, going down with a ship in the Imperial Japanese Navy, in World War II, which Japanese admirals like Admiral Yamaguchi and maybe, or selectively, senior captains like Tomio Kaku, both on Hiryu, went down with their ships voluntarily, i.e. were not killed or severely wounded in the action that sank their ships? And what impact did these avoidable losses have, if any, on the future capability of Japanese combat command? And if you have time, were there instances among Allied navies where a valuable admiral chose to go down with a ship? On both sides in World War II, there are examples of admirals and captains choosing to go down with their ship, and other examples where they decided they were going to be rescued. Admiral Yamaguchi, I think, probably would, on the Japanese side, be the most, if you like, important loss, because although both Admiral Ito aboard the Yamato and Admiral Inoguchi aboard the Musashi both chose to go down with their ships, albeit that was at such a late stage in the war that you could argue whether they went down with their ships or not. It's not really going to affect the future conduct of the Japanese Navy for the rest of the war. Whereas Yamaguchi seems to have been a relatively level-headed and quick-thinking officer, and certainly his call at Midway was a better call than Nagumo's. So his being in charge of the Japanese carriers, perhaps, if he'd been the senior ranking survivor of the Kido Butai and hadn't been, shipped off to some distant station, might have meant the Japanese carriers were conducted a little bit better than they were historically afterwards, in, say, the Guadalcanal campaign, for example. But on the Allied side, even before Yamaguchi went down with his ship, Admiral Karel Doorman, the Dutch Navy, he went down with the De Ruyter at the Battle of the Java Sea. Admiral Holland survived the explosion aboard HMS Hood, but was last seen sitting on the bridge refusing to make an effort to escape, so he went down with the ship as well. And of course, both Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach survived the attack on HMS Prince of Wales in terms of the Japanese assault, but they chose to go down with the ship as it sank. Slight side note, incidentally, Captain John Leach, who went down with Prince of Wales, his son would later be the head of the Royal Navy when the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982, which perhaps explains why he was pretty much the only one of Britain's senior military commanders to turn around and say, no, we are taking those back, and we can, whereas everyone else was like, oh, I guess the Argentines get to keep the islands then. Fun little side note. So, yes, there are a few Allied admirals who chose to go down with their ships, and in this I'm saying people who could otherwise conceivably have made it off the ship, because obviously you have things like USS Arizona exploding. Admiral Kidd was aboard Arizona. He did go down with the ship, but he didn't really have a whole lot of choice, because all indications are he was pretty much killed instantly when the magazines went off. Lord Druken asks, one of the more common myths surrounding the Battle of Hampton Roads that's brought up in your videos is the myth of USS Monitor handicapping herself by only using half charges in its guns during the battle with CSS Virginia. Are you aware of any testing, real world or otherwise, done after the fact that might indicate if Monitor's Dahlgren guns would have truly been more effective against Virginia's armour, as if the charges had been the ones that they were eventually found to be able to handle? There certainly does seem to be some evidence, so I would probably cite two examples, possibly a third. So the third example, which is a maybe, is that when the captain and crew of the Virginia made their reports afterwards, they noted that a few of the hits that had been a bit more perpendicular had dished in the armour enough that there were bulges in the wood backing. Now, of course, you have to take into account that most of the Confederate ironclads, including the Virginia, had sloped casements, so you have the possibility of, firstly, a shot being fired somewhat fore or aft of the ship, and that, of course, is going to encounter angling on impact anyway, and then of course there's the angle of the armour, which will happen even if it's perpendicular, i.e. side by side. So that's going to increase the apparent thickness of the armour, but then that's complicated by the fact that almost all ironclads on both sides in the American Civil War tended to use layered armour, which is less effective than a single thickness of plate, but that's neither by the by. So it seems that even with the 15-pound charges that Monitor went into battle with, she potentially came at least reasonably close to getting through Virginia's armour on one or two occasions with the more direct strikes. The stronger evidence is, firstly, when Dahlgren was upgrading the guns, so he was testing them to see how much firepower they could actually take. He was also firing on some targets on land, and he did manage to get through a target that had a notional 4.5-inch thickness, which is thicker than the armour that would be found on Virginia. So that would indicate that at point-blank range, at least, an 11-inch Dahlgren with 30-pound charges would have been able to get through the Virginia's plate, although, of course, Dahlgren's target, as far as I can tell, was mostly vertical, not quite as angled, so there would have been some additional resistance from Virginia's plate, but then again, Virginia's armour was thinner than 4.5 inches, so I would say that there's a fairly strong chance. And the other evidence would be the engagement of the CSS Tennessee later in the war, when you had Dahlgrens using, 11-inch Dahlgrens specifically, using higher charges than had been used at Hampton Roads, and although the 11-inch Dahlgrens didn't manage to penetrate the Tennessee's armour, the Tennessee had 6 inches of armour, although, again, laminated because it was 3 2-inch thick plates. But despite having a thickness of iron that was double that of the Virginia, the new higher-powered 11-inch Dahlgrens still managed to cause similar amounts of dishing in with some of its hits on the Tennessee, similar to what Monitor had done to the Virginia. So I think taken collectively together, yeah, if you'd been using at least 20-pound, probably 25 or 30-pound charges on Monitor in her battle with Virginia, and it had been one of the strikes that had hit near enough as close as you could get perpendicular, so the only angling you had to worry about was the angle of the casement itself, those shots probably would have gone through. Daniel Silverthorne asks, could the Japanese have refitted Fort Drum with guns removed from the conversion of Ise Hyuga to try and delay the US forces recapturing the Philippines, or would that have been a more in-depth job than was possible during the war? Could these guns have been put to use anywhere else effectively, such as in a Vanguard-style ship or as shore batteries somewhere else? The answer is technically yes, but practically no. For one thing, they didn't actually have 4 turrets because number 5 turret on one of the Ises had blown itself up. So they only actually had 3 intact turrets. But, Fort Drum only has 2, so at least for Fort Drum, potentially, you could have used those. The bigger problem, however, is that the shells used in the Fort Drum guns, which are World War I, or actually pre-World War I era US 14-inch shells, are considerably shorter than the shells used in the Japanese 14-inch guns, which means that if they were going to replace the guns in Fort Drum with the guns from Ise and Hyuga, or perhaps lift off the entire turret, you would also have to replace or redo the entire hoist system to handle the different charges and the longer shells. Now, that's not necessarily impossible. After all, the US installed those guns and turrets there in the first place, but it would have been an incredibly expensive and cost-prohibitive exercise, which would probably be in far more trouble than it was worth. So, yeah, technically, yes, it's within the realms of physical possibility, but practically speaking, given that you'd essentially be gutting the entire thing and redoing it from scratch, not really worth it. And in terms of putting those guns to better use elsewhere, well, Japan never got around to actually finishing any vaguely capital ship-sized hulls, so in theory you could do a Renown-style Vanguard-type ship, but they wouldn't finish it in time. As shore batteries, it's more tempting to say that might have been an idea, especially somewhere like, say, Okinawa, where they would have had a very long time to prepare, and it was quite a nasty struggle anyway. The flip side, of course, is that the smaller gun batteries that the Japanese did tend to use were much easier to hide, whereas if you have a full-scale battleship turret and all the associated shell handling systems, etc. below, that's a lot harder to hide and a much more obvious target. You're now entering the realms of a target large enough you might reliably hit it and therefore knock it out, with something like dive bombers, if not even shore fire support in the form of battleship gunfire support. But with that said, there are a few places that the Americans did end up attacking that might have been able to handle a 14-inch gun battery and keep it alive for long enough for it to be vaguely relevant. For example, on Iwo Jima, you've got Mount Suribachi, I suppose, with enough work, given that they did dig a bunch of tunnels and exploit and expand a bunch of caves there, you might have been able to expand a cave there enough to fit at least the guns, if not the turret, and that could have made for a rather interesting fire and counter-fire mission during the invasion of Okinawa. Ash the Lego guy asks, how were spar torpedoes deployed? It depends on the overall size of the spar torpedo and the torpedo boat. So as you can see here in this example, you have 2 spar torpedoes stashed on the deck, one on either side of what counts as a superstructure on something this size, and then these would be deployed simply by running them forward. So the spars would be mounted to some kind of pivoting structure, which you can see there right up front, and you just run them forward through a tube and out they go. Now, some spar torpedo boats like this one would have 2. Others, you'll sometimes see the spar laid directly amidships all the way down, but you'll also sometimes see either where the torpedo boat is particularly small or the charge is particularly large and therefore the spar is particularly long. You will sometimes see pictures of spar torpedo boats where the charge and the spar is obviously considerably longer than the torpedo boat is by a fair margin. And in those circumstances, the torpedo boats would, for peacetime purposes, deploy without those spar torpedoes mounted aboard, and then the actual spars and the explosive charges would be stored on land, and then come wartime, when you need to deploy them, you would then obviously break out the old spars, fit them up onto the torpedo boat, and off they would go for their specific attack mission. But as you might fairly readily infer, that usually applies to extremely small torpedo boats where you need a certain minimum clearance from the explosion that's greater than the length of the torpedo boat. And those kind of craft would generally be for harbour defence only, so it wasn't so much of a problem that they would normally not have the spar torpedo aboard, but they are very much in the minority. Usually the spars would be, with the explosive charges, would be carried aboard in a manner that you can see here, although sometimes with some spar torpedoes you would also have the charges stored aboard the craft separately from the spars, just to keep them away from being constantly drenched by water and so forth up in the front. Robert Marmerstein asks, in The Mouse That Roared, the Duchy of Grand Fenwick defeats a nuclear-armed United States using only longbows and a rented merchant vessel. Out of all the naval victories in the historical period the Channel covers, which one would you select as the most Fenwickian? Well, there's quite a few, but one which has a fair degree of comedic element to it, I think probably has to be the fight between the Japanese merchant raiders Hokukumaru and Ikukumaru versus the corvette Bengal and the tanker Odina. If it wasn't for the fact that obviously a fair number of people died or were injured, it would be the perfect naval comedy. So to set the scene, you have a Bathurst-class corvette, like this one, but not this one. This is a separate one, but gives you an idea of what they look like. Not exactly large. And this particular corvette was in the Royal Indian Navy service, and due to shortages of armament, if you'll recall, Castlemaine, which visited, was it last year? Well, the year before last, I think. Castlemaine and most Bathurst class have a 4-inch gun up front, but Bengal, as I say, due to wartime shortages, just had a 3-inch gun. That's her sum total surface armament, except for maybe some of the anti-aircraft weapons. And she's escorting the Odina, which has a few machine guns and a 4-inch gun for anti-aircraft use, which actually means the tanker is slightly more heavily armed for a surface action compared to her notional escort, although of course the escort has depth charges and so forth. Facing off against them, you have 2 armed merchant raiders, which the Japanese have rigged up much like the Germans rigged up their Hilfskreuzer. So the Ikokumaru and the Hokokumaru are both just over 10,000 tons. They have a battery of 5.5-inch guns, which are similar in throw weight and in number to a small light cruiser. They have a medium and a light anti-aircraft battery. They also have a pair of twin torpedo launchers and some aircraft and all the requisite armament for those. So either one of those armed merchant raiders outguns both of the tanker and the Bathurst by a factor of 4, and between them they outgun them by a factor of at least 8, probably more when you account for the fact that that's just barrel numbers, let alone the fact that a 5.5-inch gun obviously is considerably more lethal than a 3 or a 4-inch. So anyway, these Japanese merchant raiders head out into the Indian Ocean, and they come across the Odina and the Bengal, and they decide to open fire on it. Extra hilarity comes from the fact, of course, because the Odina is substantially larger than the Bengal, it's the Odina that spots the Japanese first because they have a higher lookout point. But initially, the thought that crosses the Allied ships' minds is, well, the Bengal will do a desperate Rawalpindi or Jervis Bay style last stand against these 2 big Japanese raiders, and then the Odina hopefully will be bought enough time to escape. Except the Odina's captain decides, no, I'm going to help out as well. And so they both charge into battle, presumably to their deaths, except that someone, depending on which account you believe, either the Bengal or the Odina, although both ships thought it was them and the Japanese thought it was the Odina, managed to score a single hit on the Hokukumaru, specifically on her torpedo launchers, which, if you'll recall, are a noted weakness of Japanese ship designs. And sure enough, the Hokukumaru disappears in a gargantuan explosion and a pillar of smoke. And of course, being a merchant ship, she's not built to the same kind of standards as a warship. So when she emerges from the smoke, it turns out there's a socking great hole in her aft section, and she's on fire, and other bits of warlike material aboard her are also on fire and exploding, and she very rapidly rolls over and sinks, so score 1 for the good guys. The Bengal then runs out of ammunition and decides, well, there's nothing more they can do. Probably best to let everyone know what's happening, and scootles on out of there. The Odina runs out of ammunition, firing on the Ikoku Maru, and Ikoku Maru scores a number of damaging hits on the Odina, and also manages to then finish it off with a pair of torpedo hits. They also spend a short amount of time opening fire on the lifeboats, because that was the thing that the Japanese like to do occasionally. But having satisfied themselves that the Odina is dead and most of the crew have been suitably shot up, they turn around and head back to pick up the survivors of the Hokoku Maru and then sail off. Except it turns out that because the Odina was a tanker, but an empty tanker, with all her compartments closed off, she's actually massively resilient, because there's nothing really aboard the ship to catch fire or explode, just a lot of empty space. And it turns out with all that empty space buttoned up, even the various holes that Ikoku Maru has punched in her aren't actually anywhere close to making her sink. So after a short conference, some of the survivors decide, well, there's really nothing to it. We might as well just go back aboard, which they do, put out a few small fires, counter-flood a few areas so her list is corrected, and then they just sail the Odina back home, much to the surprise of everybody, including the Bengal, who thought that, well, obviously, that the Odina must have been sunk by the Ikoku Maru. So you end up with this slightly hilarious situation where the Japanese sent out what are effectively 2 large light cruisers just without armour against, 2 ships which collectively between them have less main armament than your average destroyer escort, and the sum total engagement results in the Japanese having one of their 2 big armed merchant raiders blown to pieces, and both of the Allied ships surviving, with one of them thought to have been sunk, but then just being reboarded and sailed off. Adony and Becky asks, of the major navies, which is each country's largest warship that never engaged an enemy in any manner? And if you included the minor navies, would the South American battleships be the largest? Well, for the minor navies, yeah, the South American dreadnoughts would be the largest, because they're the largest ships commissioned for the minor navies. For the major navies, well, if we go with France, Germany, Japan, US, and UK, for the UK, it's going to be Vanguard, at least in the time period the channel covers, because she's just too late for the Second World War. She doesn't take part in the Korean War, and she's gone before the UK engages in any other significant major conflict. Whereas, even the Audacious class Ark Royal and Eagle did at least launch aircraft in some actions against people that the UK didn't like. For the Americans, you're probably looking at one of the Des Moines class, because I think 1 or 2 of them didn't see direct action in the Korean or Vietnam Wars. I'm pretty sure, I think Salem did, I think Newport News did, so I think probably it would be Des Moines, because obviously US aircraft carriers have bombed all sorts of people, the various Essexes and Midways. All of the battleships saw action in World War II, the fast battleships, and of the older ships, obviously everything from Arkansas onwards also saw action in World War II, and as you go down the line in terms of displacement, the older stuff like the Floridas was still doing things like the Veracruz operations and so forth, so actually you get to something around the displacement of Des Moines before you hit something that hasn't attacked somebody. For the Italians, it's probably the Dante Alighieri, because although she did see service in World War I don't believe she actually ever fired her main guns at anything. For the Japanese, it's a little bit difficult, because obviously all of their dreadnoughts and battlecruisers either saw action in the Second World War, or in the case of the Kawachis, saw definitive action in the First World War. So you're probably left with something like either the Katoris or the Tsukubas, depending on how exactly you classify engaged an enemy, because they all covered landings in the First World War to some extent or other, but whether you count being there just in case the Germans try something as engaging the enemy or not probably will then make your definition one way or the other. For the French, I think, ironically enough, it was probably the Courbet-class battleship France, because she doesn't appear to actually have attacked anybody in World War I, and then she hit a rock and foundered shortly thereafter. And for the Germans, it's probably, in terms of completed ships at least, the battleship Baden, because Bayern did take part in offensives and Hindenburg displaces slightly less. Mark Griffiths asks, I'm currently reading Cinderella Boys about RAF Coastal Command. In the book, it mentioned that Dönitz was getting decrypts of Royal Navy signals from BDNs at a time when Bletchley was unable to read Enigma due to a codebook change. The normal narrative seems to be on the primacy of the Allies' code breaking. What are your thoughts on this? It's true that Axis code breaking is an often understudied and underappreciated part of the cryptological war in World War II. However, if you look at the trajectories of successfully intercepted and decoded messages on either side, on the Allied side, particularly obviously with Bletchley Park, essentially what you have is Enigma is a very, very secure way initially of transmitting messages. So initially the decoded messages are very, very small in number. But as time goes on, as methods improve, Enigma is captured, you get the introduction of computers and so forth, the number of decoded German messages, either Enigma or various other forms of encryption, gradually goes up and up and up. And then when you combine that with increasing numbers of Allied escorts and so forth, it gets very bad for the Germans. Whereas Axis communications interception of Royal Navy signals, both obviously German and Italian, generally speaking, starts off relatively well, and as the war progresses, gets worse and worse and worse. So the number of messages they're intercepting goes down, which of course has a double effect, because early on they have the cryptological advantage, but they don't have the numbers of U-boats and so forth to necessarily fully exploit it. And then when they really, really need it to help the U-boats avoid the mass escort groups and everything, then they don't have it. And that's down to a couple of things that are also probably worth wider discussion. One of which is that the Allies tended to have a lot more forms of encryption. So just because you'd broken one particular cipher code, well, that might tell you something about, let's say what convoys in the Mediterranean are doing, but that won't necessarily tell you what convoys in the Atlantic are doing or what the home fleet is doing, because they will be using either different variants on the cipher or a completely different cipher entirely. And while the Germans obviously did have more ciphers than just Enigma, accounted for a vast amount of their communication. So once you cracked it, you had access to almost everything, whereas for various Allied codes, particularly British codes, obviously, which the Germans were mostly intercepting, cracking one didn't mean you actually had access to absolutely everything. You had to crack quite a few at the same time. Related to that was the fact that the British and the Allies would constantly update their ciphers and introduce brand new ones, whereas obviously the Germans, remaining convinced that Enigma was unbroken, kept using Enigma, which accounted for why the German success rate continued to decrease, as well as increased levels of change within the ciphers. So, one-time pads or constantly changing your decoding tables. Initially, it'd be once every few weeks, or once every month or so, depending on the cipher. By midpoint during the war, the particular method of enciphering was being changed on a daily basis, which made it, practically impossible for the Germans to keep up. The other thing is that the Germans overplayed their hand when it came to decipherment a couple of times, which helped the Allies realise, hey, our codes have been broken, we need to switch them. And you'll remember I've discussed previously when it comes to Allied use of intelligence, which is something that still goes on today, the dichotomy of we have this intel, but if we act on it, we give away that we have the intel, which gives away that we've penetrated the enemy's communications, and therefore is it worth doing, as opposed to not doing anything, taking the loss, but maintaining the penetration of enemy communications for more important things. Well, in some cases, the Germans, as I said, overplayed their hand a little bit, because remember, the Allies were getting better and better reading German codes. So when, for example, the Allies decided, okay, we're going to use our intelligence to slightly relocate the course of a convoy so it can avoid a German wolf pack that's forming up, and then they intercept German messages almost immediately after they've sent out the redirection messages that tell the U-boats to pack up where they are and move to this new hunting position, which is obviously where the convoy is now going to go. Then the Allies go, hang on a minute, there's no way they could have known about that unless they'd penetrated our codes. We better start updating and changing our codes. And that happened a few times with various German efforts. Silder and Machine Works asks, the German bombardment missions off the British coast during World War II were meant to draw out a portion of the Grand Fleet so they could be destroyed. The raid on Scarborough, Whitby and Hartlepool succeeded in the first part with 10 British capital ships present compared to 22 German, but it resulted in only scattered inconclusive fighting before the Germans returned to port. If von Ingenhol was not so restricted by the Kaiser's orders to preserve his forces, could he have brought the British forces to battle, and what would the outcome be? Historically, Beattie and Seymour bodged the signals, unsurprisingly, causing the 1st Battle Cruiser Squadron to fail to react to sighting reports. Would that have contributed to a British defeat? So there's two separate elements to this. The bodged signals by Beattie and Seymour take place largely after the High Seas Fleet has actually already gone home, and they concern whether or not they would have intercepted 1st Scouting Group on its way back. And in that battle, obviously, Beattie initially would have been probably at a slight disadvantage because it would have been 4 battle cruisers each once everybody showed up, but the Germans also had Blücher, whereas, well, I mean, Beattie does have some armoured cruisers, but nothing quite compared to Blücher. So Beattie probably would have actually been on the back foot until Warrender arrived to help him, and then it would have been the Germans that would have been on the back foot. But winding back a little bit to when the High Seas Fleet could have engaged before it went home, it's a little bit of a difficult one because the Germans do have a golden opportunity. You've got 6 13.5-inch armed dreadnoughts on the British side, plus 4 battle cruisers and various escorts. The Germans have the entire High Seas Fleet, as it is at the time, so they have a definitive advantage. The two issues that they're facing is, one, it's not just that von Ingenhol has gone far beyond the Kaiser's orders, which recently he has, but even if those orders weren't in place, it's a question of what does von Ingenhol think he's encountered? Because remember, the Germans reckon that the British will send out battle cruisers, which is why they are conducting this raid, but they don't know that Warrender's 6 battleships have been sent out. So when they start encountering the edges of the British forces, the destroyers, and the British destroyers get mixed up with the High Seas Fleet's outer destroyer screen, you end up in this odd situation of you being maybe 10, 15 minutes away from the kind of engagement the Germans dreamed of, but Ingenhol believes, at least according to his reports, that he's encountered the edge of the entire Grand Fleet, and that is a situation that he doesn't want to be in. That's counter to German strategy, and indeed you see what happens when Scheer encounters the entire Grand Fleet. They turn around and leave. So even without the Kaiser's orders, it's possible that von Ingenhol would have just turned around thinking that Warrender's force was actually a lot larger than it really was. But assuming, for whatever reason, that he doesn't believe this, maybe he thinks he's found the outriding destroyers of the British battlecruiser formation for whatever reason, you would then have another problem, which is, yes, of course, the British are massively outnumbered, but the Germans, like the British, don't have as many ships present as they would at the Battle of Jutland, and that means that you have relatively few modern German dreadnoughts, and when you line up the German dreadnoughts that can actually realistically make 21 knots versus Warrender's ships, and then factor in for firepower, it's a much closer match than you might otherwise be comfortable with as von Ingenhol. especially once you factor in the British battle cruisers, if they happen to be nearby. The Germans still have an advantage, but it's not as large one as they might necessarily want, because the Helgolands, the Nassaus, and any pre-dreadnoughts that are tagging along are all considerably slower than what the British ships can achieve. So Churchill later on tries to justify the whole thing by saying, oh, well, the British still could have run away. Well, they could have run away from a chunk of the High Seas Fleet and fought a running engagement with the rest, basically the Kaisers and the Königs. But that still would have been to their disadvantage, because, of course, any British ship that gets hit badly enough to be slowed down can be chewed up by the rest of the High Seas Fleet as they follow, as they try to retreat, that's the British trying to retreat, whereas obviously any German ship that's hit badly enough to slow down, oh, well, they've slowed down. So, well, they fall back on the rest of the High Seas Fleet. So it's a net advantage for the Germans, just not as much as one that might appear on paper. The biggest thing would be where an interception would occur, because if the interception occurs where the British have a clear line of retreat, then the destroyers and light cruisers of the outer edges of Warrender's formation will go, hang on a minute, lots of German battleships appearing, we need to get out of here. Signal Warrender, Warrender can turn on the speed, and he can escape. There's not a lot that von Ingenhol can do about that, because the only thing he can possibly try is to call the various scattered bits of First Scouting Group to try and head them off, and with the best will in the world, scattered elements of First Scouting Group, Beattie and Warrender can blow through those fairly decisively, and it won't look good for First Scouting Group. But if von Ingenhol, by luck or by judgment, can position the High Seas Fleet in such a way as they sit between, at least partially between, Beattie and Warrender's route of escape and home, then they can bring them to battle, because at that point the only choices the British would have would be, in theory, to maybe make a run for the Channel and the Harwich force. But if they don't immediately turn around and do that, then there's not a lot they can do. They have to try and fight their way through the High Seas Fleet, and at that point, yeah, a significant number of them will probably get destroyed or at least badly damaged. Sapper Ninja asks, it's hardly a secret that you believe Beattie could have performed better in some aspects of his naval service. What were Beattie's and Jellicoes' criticisms of each other, and what criticisms of each were fair and which were not? Well, the funny thing is that most of the Beattie versus Jellicoe war of words, in as far as the two actual men involved were concerned, was almost entirely one-sided, because Jellicoe thought internal arguments of this nature were pretty much beneath him and, didn't really suit the nature of the Royal Navy. And so Jellicoe himself, apart from writing a couple of memoirs about his time in World War I generally, which of course would include Jutland, really didn't say all that much. Whereas Beattie, once he got into the position of First Sea Lord and thereafter, would continually, either personally or via orders, ensure that attacks were made on Jellicoe. And, therefore, if Jellicoe doesn't really make any specific directed personal attacks on Beattie, then there aren't any criticisms particularly to evaluate, although if you want to read his account of being in charge of the Grand Fleet, you can detect some, shall we say, slightly more British subtle criticisms of the conduct of the battlecruiser squadron or battlecruiser fleet. He doesn't specifically say Beattie, but he does mention, I didn't have the information I needed from the battlecruiser squadron, implying that he really should have had that information, but there you go, and which is entirely fair. Whereas Beattie either authored or backed up or encouraged multiple polemics against Jellicoe, which, things like, he was far too overly cautious, he was indecisive, blah, 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 and near enough, pretty much all of those criticisms are unfair. About the only thing that vaguely strikes home, and that's mostly because even a broken clock is right twice a day, is that yes, Jellicoe was a bit cautious. Was he overly cautious? No. In hindsight, given what he knew and given the weird and wonderful disjointed information he was receiving, it's entirely understandable why he made the decisions he did. In hindsight, yes, you could say he is overcautious, but that requires knowing stuff that Jellicoe himself didn't know at the time. The thing I'd be most interested to find in this whole argument is that we know the Admiralty was in the middle of preparing a big report on Jutland. And from the sounds of it, it was highly critical of Beattie, because it was about to be published when Beattie became First Sea Lord, and the first thing he did was turn around and go, no, I want you to change this. And of course, the officers who'd conducted the report went, no, this is what happened. And then Beattie overrode them and said, oh, if you're not going to change it to favour me, then I'm going to order you to destroy the entire report and write a new one, which was the first big polemic he threw in Jellicoe's direction. I'd be really interested to know if the officers actually fully complied with that and all copies of the report were destroyed, or are there still copies of that original report around? Because, of course, Bacon, who was an officer at the time, would write kind of a reply to Beattie's new report, which was highly critical of Beattie and references a lot of things which apparently were in the original report. But does a copy of the original Beattie suppressed report still exist? I don't know. Does anyone else know? J. Mace asks, in a previous Drydock episode, when answering a question about cruisers taking on the role of battleships when battleships were not around, you mentioned that destroyers were part of the battle line screen. I found this comment interesting because it had been my understanding that during a fleet surface battle, destroyers would attempt to make torpedo attacks on the battleships, and the cruisers were there to screen the battleships against those torpedo attacks. If the destroyers were actually part of the fleet screen, then what were they and the cruisers there to screen against? Essentially each other. The problem was that there were nowhere near enough cruisers in anybody's fleet to conduct a full fleet screen around a major fleet of battleships. And in addition to that, when you're talking about scout cruisers and light or light armoured cruisers, especially in a World War I context, and to a certain extent in a World War II context as well, although they have to throw heavy cruisers in there, you generally want to operate the cruisers as a squadron, both for survivability purposes and because, well, if you have your cruisers scattered all around the fleet and the enemy concentrates their cruisers in a squadron or two, they can then punch through and destroy your isolated cruisers, and then they get the scouting information they want, which means both sides group their cruisers into squadrons, and now there are big gaps in your screen, and those are the gaps that destroyers tend to fill. Plus, you tend to have a few destroyers with the cruisers, depending on the weather conditions. And the reason for this is simple. Well, one, you can have a lot more destroyers, so you can actually establish a meaningful overall screen. And this is talking about surface action rather than anti-aircraft defense. And secondly, of course, you can't guarantee where the enemy is going to appear. So if you have 2, 3, 4 cruiser squadrons, but the enemy appears in between them, well, not only do you need a destroyer element there to spot them in the first place, but also it means those destroyers are in a good place to attack straight up. Now, not every single destroyer would be committed to this outer fleet screen, so the destroyers also would tend to travel in flotillas, although they can be a little bit more spread out because their speed means they're much more easily able to reform. But when you look at, for example, the maps and plans of the Battle of Jutland, you'll notice that in the initial stages, when you're talking about scouting and trying to establish where the enemy is and stopping the enemy from working out where you are, you'll have various destroyer flotillas scattered around along with cruiser squadrons to both conduct recon of the enemy and stop the enemy reconning you. But once the battle itself is engaged, you tend to see pretty much all the light elements, whether they be cruiser or destroyer squadrons, will either draw back or draw to either side of the main battle line engagement and let the big capital ships duke it out. Occasionally then destroyer flotillas will rush in and try and deliver torpedo attacks and so forth, or try and get around the front or rear of the enemy line to do so. But what the destroyer squadron or flotilla is doing during a battle is very different from what it's doing during the fleet sailing prior to the battle. And of course, if an enemy destroyer squadron is or flotilla is spotted heading in to try and attack in a battle, then you might dispatch your own destroyers because they'll be faster to respond. torpedo boat destroyer, obviously job titles in the name, they are there to also counter destroyers. Cruisers might be a little bit too slow, they might be a little bit too large and therefore attract capital ship firepower, and as I said, you don't have quite as many of them. So destroyers will partially be attacking the other fleet, partly be stopping the enemy destroyers attacking your fleet, and the cruisers during battle, generally speaking in a surface action, will be there to back up the main fleet and act as a stopgap if your destroyer screen doesn't succeed in stopping the enemy destroyer screen from getting through. And again, when you look at the track charts of big surface engagements, you'll see that even prior to battle commencing, some destroyer flotillas or squadrons will be out on fleet screening duty, and others will be being retained either with or behind the capital ships as the primary concentrated offensive power, because obviously if you have a broad scattering of destroyers and they've just had a running gunfight with enemy destroyers, they might need to consolidate their strength back together, but while they're doing that, you can send one of your fresh flotillas or squadrons rushing in to deliver a torpedo strike. Sam Signorelli asks, in Drydock 304 you explained the differences in rudder position like standard and full. What about hard over? For example, hard over would seem to imply turning the rudder all the way into the stops, but you said that wasn't usually done due to the risk of jamming. Correct. It's a bit of a risk versus reward situation. So normally, if you want to turn the ship as hard as quote-unquote possible, you would do right full rudder if you're in the US, for example, which would be a degree or two away from being completely over as far as mechanically is possible to go. And that's for pretty much the reasons you cited, which I mentioned before, which is that if you do slam the rudder all the way to the stops, there is a chance that you might jam the rudder and it's not going to go back where it should, which is obviously a major problem. However, obviously in normal circumstances, and even in most combat circumstances, you don't want to take that risk, because the last thing you want is a jammed rudder sending you going round in circles. But when you are faced with certain circumstances, like massive enemy aerial attack or incoming torpedoes or something, you have to start weighing things up. There is the risk that you jam your rudder and you end up going around in circles. Now, if you're engaged in a prolonged gunfight, for instance, you might consider that risk, which will make you very vulnerable and make it difficult to bring your own guns to bear, is not worth it, because the enemy can just keep firing their guns fairly regularly, so you might only use up to, say, full rudder for combat maneuvers at that point. But then you spot an incoming torpedo spread. Now, being hit by a torpedo, generally speaking, is going to do far more damage to you than any single shell hit could, outside of, golden BB hits to your machinery or your magazines, which is what your armor is supposed to prevent. And now your risk is much higher, plus, of course, any torpedo hit means flooding, whereas a lot of shell hits might just be fire. And so you now have to consider that risk. If you put your rudder full over, you might evade the torpedoes, but if the situation is a little bit dicey, you might then consider, well, actually putting the rudder hard over, giving us that little bit extra responsiveness, a little bit tighter turn, that might now be worth it, because the risk of going around in circles is still, it's a risk, it's not guaranteed. But if the other option is a near guaranteed hit from a big torpedo, yeah, you're immediately going to be slamming that rudder all the way to the stops. So essentially, what is the danger that you're trying to avoid? Once the danger level exceeds a certain point, you're going to take the risk of potentially jamming your rudder. Salami Sales Express asks, Drac, I know there's some fun fact or tidbit of knowledge that you've recently come across that you'd love to share, but it doesn't relate to any particular topic at hand, or it just simply isn't enough to make a video on. What is it? Well, there's one little bit of information which I find really, really cool, but which, as you said, I don't think I've ever really brought up before. So I'm going to share it with you now. There's a few bits, but this one I really like. And that is that an awful lot of Royal Navy action photos, if you like, so photos taken by Royal Navy officers in a battle, which are included in the reports from the battle, often have a hidden feature, which an awful lot of reproductions in various books don't actually show, perhaps because either the author didn't know about it or for whatever reason people didn't want to include it. And this can be seen, for example, in the photos from the Battle of Narvik. Now, there's a whole series of photos, which I've got, and now a bunch of them are taken from the Swordfish float plane from HMS Warspite, including this one. That's why they're from the air. Some of them are taken from ships as well. And a lot of these you will have seen in various books because, you know, they're some of the few photos from that engagement and from the Norwegian campaign generally as far as the naval element is concerned. Although a lot of them are very, very fuzzy and indistinct because they're reproductions of reproductions of reproductions of reproductions. So if anyone's interested and wants some nice clear photos, get in contact with me because these are, you know, first generation reproductions taken with a high def camera of the original photos themselves. So the only thing you could do better than this would be to get the negatives. Now, that aside, what you see here is Romboxfjord, which I must admit is really odd looking at it now, given that I've now been to Romboxfjord, albeit in the middle of summer, so, you know, there's not as much snow. But it is really weird looking at it going, well, there's a bridge there now, amongst other things, and roads and so forth. But if you just looked at this photo and perhaps read some of the captioning that goes with it in the report, you'd go, okay, there's a German destroyer right there, kind of top center-ish. You can probably just about see it coming up close to the coast of the fjord. And there's a bunch of oil slick running back towards the entrance and a few other small features. But overall, you might think this isn't a particularly interesting photo. But if you read very carefully, what you'll know is that this photo, along with the various others in the collection, and as I say, across World War II, some of them have been taken and then processed on very, very thin celluloid paper. And then somebody has gone in and made additional annotations to the photo behind the photo at the back. And it's only when you very carefully take the photo and hold it up to the light that these additional details come to light. Haha. So, for example, with this one, this is exactly the same photo, only taken out of its little page and held up to the light, hence the slightly different lighting because I'm holding it up to a window. And now you can see there are two track marks in blue faintly. And track mark 1, if you look at the accompanying page, tells you that this is the track of a torpedo heading towards the German destroyer, and point 2 is usefully just, hey, look, here's the German destroyer in case you missed it. But instead of writing on the front of the photo and thus potentially destroying other elements of the photo that might be useful for intel analysis or so forth, this has all been done on the back. So there's a lot of photos like this where there's additional information that the Royal Navy's included, but people rarely, if ever, know about it. Paul from Chicago asks, could a close blockade work against Germany much after 1900 or so? Or do the requirements of coaling invalidate the strategy of close blockade against a near-peer fleet in being during the age of steam and steel? Even if torpedoes and sea mines weren't a thing, given the amount of time it takes to coal a ship, which requires a harbour and access to a collier, and the amount of times a ship needs to coal in a month, being 3 to 5 times, maybe, it seems the High Seas Fleet could choose to come out at a time that the Grand Fleet was without a handful of dreadnoughts, thus creating a rough parity with the British. Well, the single biggest problem is sea mines and torpedoes. The mines, to a certain extent, can probably be dealt with, because if you enact a close blockade quickly enough, you can probably suppress enemy attempts at mine laying, but the combination of submarines and torpedoes is the real big kicker, because obviously they can come out and as soon as they get lucky, as they would prove early in World War I, they're very capable of doing, you're down a very expensive capital ship. Now, if those weren't a thing, as you suggest in the second part of your question, and it's mostly looking at the coaling issue, then it becomes a bit more interesting, because obviously a close blockade done in the age of sail involved capital ships sitting off of an enemy port with maybe a handful of frigates there to provide close-in spotting. But the kind of economic close blockade that evolved from that you would see done during the American Civil War under various names and in other parts of the 19th century, and indeed which the British thought initially of doing to Germany in the First World War, when it comes to stopping enemy trade, you don't need the battle fleet there and then for a number of reasons. Firstly, obviously, it's very expensive, and there are the coaling issues that you mentioned. But secondly, merchant shipping is, generally speaking, not going to need a capital ship to deal with, but also the faster merchant ships, so fast cargo vessels and especially liners, might be as fast or faster than your battleships, especially in the pre-dreadnought period, whereas they are unlikely to be as fast or faster than cruisers. And in cases where they're slower than both types of warship, the cruisers are even faster, so can cover a larger area so they can catch more shipping. So a close blockade of Germany circa 1900 and onward wouldn't usually contain the battle fleet. It would predominantly be done with initially protected cruisers, later light armoured cruisers, with probably destroyers sorting in support from places like Harwich and Dover. The bigger cruisers, so the larger protected cruisers and perhaps the armoured cruisers, would probably be blockading what in German is known as the Skagerrak, the gap between Sweden, Norway and Denmark, because of course the one problem with blockading Germany is although the Germans don't have that much of a coastline, and so blockading the western coastline of Germany is easy, the eastern coastline of Germany involves either going all the way around Denmark to blockade it up close and personal, or you blockade that entrance into the North Sea. The latter option is better for the British logistically and still cuts off the Germans from international trade, but it does still allow them to trade and run around in the Baltic. So if you were going to send a fleet round to blockade the eastern part of German coastline areas, then you would need ideally a friendly port nearby from which to base for coaling purposes. In theory, you could get away with coaling out of a neutral port because you just need to coal up and head back out again, but that's obviously then dependent on the goodwill of the neutral port authorities to let you do so. The larger problems that you would face would also be things like, what does Denmark do? Because Denmark could, in theory, trade normally because it's a neutral power, but you then enter the slightly difficult phase of, well, what if German companies set up shell companies or agents in Denmark to import things that you're trying to stop getting into Germany? They then land in Denmark and then are transshipped overland into Germany. Now that means you have to sort of blockade the Danish coast as well to inspect ships for potential war contraband violations and so forth, and that becomes a lot more difficult. Now, this was done in World War I with, for example, ships heading into Dutch ports and so forth, because the Germans tried exactly that, but it does mean that unless you want to antagonize neutral countries enough that they come in on your opponent's side, there might be a degree of leaking through those areas. But if your submarines and mines aren't a thing, and torpedoes as well, then the British fleet is likely to be based a lot closer, either in channel ports or perhaps in the Nore, and so they wouldn't necessarily be used directly on the close blockade. It would be those longer range cruisers doing the blockade, and yes, you would have to cycle them back, but you've got a lot more of them and they've got more endurance on station, and as and when they radio back, hey, we're seeing a lot of smoke, looks like the High Seas Fleet is coming out to play, you've then got a while to bring your own fleet up and ready to play, because that kind of deployment is a fairly major commitment. Glenn Ricafrente asks, in your chat with Italian military archives a couple of months ago, you made the point that the Royal Navy was much more aggressive going after the Kriegsmarine's surface vessels than they were with Italian ships in the Mediterranean. I'm not sure I understand why. Can you please elaborate? There are quite a number of factors involved in this, and it is generally, an accurate statement to make. But for the purposes of a dry dock answer, one of the major concerns that the Royal Navy had with the Regia Marina versus the Kriegsmarine was simply that the Regia Marina was a far more creditable surface fleet. Now, what I mean by that is that they actually had a respectable number of ships, especially relative to the Royal Navy strength in theatre. So the reason you've got a picture here of HMS Renown is because she's actually one of the ships that faces off repeatedly against both the Regia Marina and the Kriegsmarine, and you can kind of see from the way that she acts against both navies this principle in action. So what it comes down to essentially is that if you are confronting a Kriegsmarine vessel, it is, at least on a larger scale capital ship or cruiser scale, it's going to happen in either the Atlantic or in the North Sea, or en route between the two. Now, if that happens, you can be fairly confident of two things. Firstly, the Kriegsmarine doesn't have that many capital ships or cruisers. So if they lose one, it's a statistically much larger percent loss for them than it would be for the Italians. So, for example, the Italians start the war with 7 heavy cruisers. The Germans start the war, in theory, with 3, and there's kind of whether Prince Eugen counts or not at that point is a bit on the fence, but very soon afterwards, thanks to the Norwegian campaign and the sinking of Blucher, they're down to 2, and we're talking about conventional 8-inch heavy cruisers. You can argue that potentially there are 6 if you include the Deutschlands, but again, Graf Spee goes away, so even if you're counting Lützow and Admiral Scheer, plus Hipper and Prince Eugen, once Prince Eugen's fully up to speed, the Germans have 4 heavy cruisers versus the Italians 7. At least early on. So if the Germans then lose a heavy cruiser, well, that's a quarter of their cruiser force gone. It's less impactful for the Italians to lose a heavy cruiser. So when you're weighing up a confrontation of, well, how much am I willing to risk to hurt them, then you have this to bear in mind. You know, you could potentially risk more against the Kriegsmarine because the reward would be a lot higher. And similarly for capital ships, at any given time, although the Germans eventually would build 4 battleships, they realistically only ever have 2, maybe 3 in commission at any one time, and usually 2. So if they lose 1, they've lost 33 to 50% of their capital ship strength. Whereas with the Italians, on a really good day, they might have 6 capital ships. So they're going to lose a lot less strength if they lose a single ship. So again, you have to factor that in. The other thing, which is kind of related to this lower number of ships that the Kriegsmarine has, is that when you confront them, what are the chances that they have backup? So, for example, when Rodney sees Gneisenau during Operation Berlin, she will very happily charge Gneisenau down, or at least attempt to, because Rodney knows that at the very worst, she'll run into Scharnhorst as well. And Rodney's pretty confident she can take both of them. Similarly at Lofoten, the 2 Scharnhorst are spotted. They are the only 2 German capital ships in existence at that point. Renown seems to be fairly confident she can take them, because she knows, in both cases, both Rodney and Renown, they know the Germans don't have any backup coming at that scale. And you have the same thing, especially in the Atlantic, but even to a certain degree in the North Sea. If you have, let's say, Battle of Barents Sea, a couple of German heavy cruisers, if you think you've got a decent chance of either taking them on or at least doing a lot of damage to them, you know the Germans don't have anything out there that's going to come to help them if it comes down to a knife fight. With the Italians, not only do you know they have a lot more ships, so potentially there could be other ships out there to back them up, but also the theatre they're operating in, the Mediterranean, there's a fairly decent chance there are more ships out there, especially given the way that a lot of engagements with Italian fleet elements tended to go. I kind of mentioned this as well in that chat, and I've mentioned it before, but a lot of engagements between the Royal Navy and the Italian Navy, where you involve multiple ships, tend to be one side encounters the other, whichever side has the advantage in ships chases the other falls back on a slightly larger grouping of ships, who then chase the first lot, who then fall back on their own larger grouping of ships, who then chase the lot they were chasing in the first place, and so on and so forth. So you see this in a lot of battles. British light cruisers will chase an Italian destroyer or light cruiser. They'll run into Italian heavy cruisers. They'll run back towards more British light cruisers or British capital ships. At some point, an Italian capital ship will show up or two, and so on and so forth. So if you're a British captain and you see, let's say, for sake of argument, an Italian 12-inch or 12.6-inch, technically at that point, battleship, you might think, yeah, one-on-one I can beat this guy, but what support does he have out there? Is there another battleship out there? If there is another battleship out there, is it another 12.6-inch? Is it a Littorio? Are there 2 Littorios? Could there potentially be 3 or 4 heavy cruisers out there? 2 flotillas of destroyers? All of these are possible and unknown. And so am I going to really risk myself pushing really hard against this one ship when I potentially could then be counterstruck and then the Italians lose nothing and I get sunk? Whereas, as I said, with the Kriegsmarine, you see, let's say, a Scharnhorst out there or a Hipper, 99% chance nothing's coming to help them. So if you're not going to decisively lose that engagement right from the start, you might as well have a crack at them. Or to put it another way, imagine prison fights. The Royal Navy confronting the Regia Marina is essentially 2 guys about to get at it in the prison canteen with lots of potentially hulking gangmates hanging back a table or 2 further to see how this is going to go. How do you think they're going to play it? Kriegsmarine versus Royal Navy fights, generally speaking, tend to be the slightly smaller guy locked in solitary with the big hulking bruiser, and the big hulking bruiser going, oh, guess what? No one's coming to save you. Library of Context asks, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbour seems to currently be attributed to a fire in her coal bunker that triggered a magazine detonation. Did this ship have any means to detect and fight a fire of this type? And has any other noteworthy vessel, military or civilian, been lost to a coal bunker fire? There wasn't anything in terms of sort of the modern kind of smoke alarm or sprinkler systems in the coal bunkers, but coal bunker fires were not exactly unusual in warships of the period, or indeed even in merchant ships of the period, Titanic conspiracy theories aside. They happened not on a regular basis, but let's say on a semi-regular basis. People wouldn't be particularly surprised if someone said, oh, one of the coal bunkers is on fire, because it tended not to be a massive raging inferno. It tended to be a smouldering type of affair. Usually, the way it would be detected would be someone going, there appears to be a fire in this coal bunker, because the bunkers would be regularly checked for, well, fires and flooding and all sorts of other things, as well as, taking coal from them. For fighting the fire, well, of course, if you have a fire in a coal bunker, it's surrounded by fuel. And also, if you soak the coal bunker, you're flooding it, which is not going to help the ship's stability, but also you're potentially ruining a bunch of good fuel. Usually, the way of fighting a coal bunker fire was simply to use that bunker first to empty it out of all the good coal that wasn't on fire, and then as you dug away and therefore had better access to the bit that was on fire, you could then either damp out the embers or scrape it out or whatever. It usually wasn't a particularly major affair, other than something you just wanted to get a hold of, partly to stop it eating away at your decent fuel stock reserves, and also obviously to stop it spreading and getting properly out of control. With the Maine, it seems to have been partially the exact location of the fire, in as much as within the coal bunker it seems to have occurred right adjacent to a magazine, but also the fact that the space between the bunker and the magazine wasn't necessarily as well insulated as it should have been, which was a problem that cropped up in a number of other ships, in terms of magazine insulation either not being installed or not being installed properly. Now, I'm not aware of any definitive attribution of coal bunker fires as the cause of a loss in a major warship other than the Maine, but coal bunker fires have been suggested as one of the possible contributory factors or direct factors in the destruction of warships in a number of cases, particularly where ammunition cook-offs occurred. But the thing is usually if you have a major magazine cook-off, whereas with the Maine it appears to have been a 6-inch magazine, there's generally so little left of the area that working out whether it was a bunker fire or something else is usually rather difficult. But a fair number of ships that were sunk could have been helped on their way to the bottom by something that's related to a coal bunker fire, which would be a coal dust explosion in the bunkers. Because, as well, those of you who've done damage control exercises, etc., will already know, when a ship takes a major blow, whether that be from a shell, a torpedo, or a mine, or whatever, because shock waves travel faster through solid materials like metal than they do through air, what will usually happen is every single tiny bit of dust and particulate and loose paint, etc., anywhere in the ship in the vicinity of the impact site will immediately be catapulted into the air. So even before let's say a shell has penetrated the ship and gotten inside, or the onrush of water from a torpedo, or the body of a missile or whatever, the first thing that will happen is the impacted area becomes this choke hazard of almost fog-like air, clogged with dust and all sorts. And then an explosion happens. And this relates to my personal theory on how British battle cruisers end up going up at Jutland with dust-infused nitrocellulose, etc. But by the by, the point is, with a coal-fired ship, what you could end up happening, and indeed does appear to have happened in some cases, is when ships were hit by torpedoes or shells, etc., the shock wave initially started up a bunch of coal dust in their bunkers, thus creating a fuel air bomb. Then the explosion arrived and found, well, there's a fuel air bomb here. Kaboom! Much, much bigger explosion than you would otherwise anticipate. This is, incidentally, one of the suggested causes and a front runner for the secondary explosions you see in the Lusitania after she's torpedoed. Michael Gilson asks, the Iowas were built to deal with the Congo's speed, but while still having the firepower and protection of a frontline battleship, in a sense recreating the conception of the Captain class. What if instead they'd been built more like Renown and Repulse, iterating on existing hull designs but with reduced firepower and protection? I'm thinking perhaps a North Carolina hull with 2 main gun turrets, but fitted with a South Dakota class's machinery, possibly even an additional boiler set to that, and using the resources saved to build a couple more South Dakotas. Would this have worked out for the ships, or for the US Navy as a whole? Well, there are 2 potential ways you could go about that. The first would be, like you suggested here, so you have your 2 16-inch 50 turrets up forward, and nothing aft, and then you've got a whole bunch of extra machinery. And in this case, as you can see with this design, I've opted with the standard 5 twin mounts either side, but since we've got a bit of additional deck space lacking an aft turret, and obviously stretching for machinery, I've also taken the liberty of putting in a super firing 5-inch 38 above turret 2 and a little 5-inch twin aft as well, which actually means that this ship has a 14-gun heavy anti-aircraft broadside, which is quite substantial. The other option is to do something like this, which is really renowning it up. Now, I've kept the forward super-firing 5-inch 38, but eliminated the aft one, and in this case, you've gone with same 6-gun armament, but in 3 twin turrets, 2 forward, 1 aft. Albeit in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, it seems that their twin turret is literally just the triple turret with the centre gun removed. It doesn't actually get any smaller, but that's a bit odd, but whatever. In any case, I think something more like this is probably more like what the US Navy would do. They, after their initial dalliances with the North Carolina being all forward firing, they tend to prefer having the aft turret, and indeed if they are adapting out of a North Carolina hull, then obviously it's much easier to just go, okay, roughly the same balance of gun turrets, just with different amounts of firepower, than it would be to completely rework everything to compensate for the fact you're missing an entire turret and its barbette, etc. aft. I'm not sure the resources saved would be enough to build 2 more South Dakotas, because, for example, you're not making any real saving on machinery. It's mostly just in terms of tonnage of steel. And I think if they had done this kind of thing, then any savings probably would have gone into accelerating Montana-class construction rather than 2 more South Dakotas, which the US Navy was never really entirely happy with. They're very good ships, but they're good ships constrained by treaty limits. If they've got the option of, let's say they're doing this kind of thing instead of the Iowas, well, they're going to build their other non-treaty ship, i.e. the Montanas, even faster. But if we have at its base a North Carolina hull armed with 6 instead of 9 guns, an extra 5-inch 38 mount and a lot more speed, how would it have worked out for the ships? Well, realistically, given that the Iowas never got to engage a peer in combat, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, except for the fact that they might be more likely to engage a peer in combat, because instead of being the sort of front line battleship and thus kept to the battle line, if they've built essentially renown on steroids as a battle cruiser or 4, they might be used a little bit more judiciously up front on, to go after enemy surface vessels. So they might actually see full surface action, and ultimately they still have reasonably decent protection and a lot of firepower, good fire control, etc., etc. In terms of how this would have worked out for the US Navy as a whole, I think a lot of it comes down to what happens with the Montanas, because post-war, these ships would be, being based on a North Carolina hull, most likely be considerably smaller than the Iowas. They won't have as much firepower as the Iowas, and they, by being smaller, also won't have as much room for adaptation as the Iowas. So there is a higher chance of them going to the scrapyard. The one salvation they might have is speed. And I think a lot of it will depend on what happens with the Montanas, because if they use, as I would suggest, the additional resources freed up to accelerate the construction of the Montanas, then what you might see is the US Navy retaining a couple of Montanas through the Cold War, because that would be probably what they managed to get constructed before the rest get cancelled. And most, if not all, of this hypothetical Iowa battlecruiser class probably going to the scrapyard. If they don't manage to keep the Montanas around, then these ships would probably still be kept around for a while, again because of simply their speed is being the only capital ships able to keep up in the US inventory with the carriers. But I suspect they probably wouldn't see as long a service career with the US Navy, simply because, again, less space, less room for adaptation. The only caveat to that might actually be, if they had done something like the first option, that might stick around considerably longer, because although it's smaller than an Iowa, it might have a similar shelf life because of that massive unoccupied aft space, whereas obviously on the historic Iowas they stuck phalanx and missile launchers, etc., amidships in exchange for a couple of 5-inch 38 mounts. In this case, you could drop the aft 5-inch 38 turret and maybe you also drop the aft 2 5-inch 38s on either wings, missile launchers on the wings, but then you've got a huge amount of space aft, which might lend itself to either extensive flight deck operations, even more missiles, perhaps even inserting a basic surface-to-air missile defense capability or something like that. Timu Loka asks, why is there so little knowledge of the Estonian submarines from the interwar period, and when are you going to visit EML Lembit in Tallinn? In terms of visiting the Lembit, the rest of the shipshape crew actually managed to do that at the tail end of the Scandinavia trip, but I had to head home a couple of days early, so tragically I didn't get a chance to see her. I do want to see her at some point in the future, so we shall see. Potentially might tag it on to the end of the European trip that I'm planning for later in this year. But in terms of why there's so little knowledge of Estonian submarines in the interwar period, I suspect it's a combination of two things. One, I suspect the vast majority of people probably don't even realise Estonia had submarines in the interwar period, so they don't go looking for information on them. And two, an awful lot of the information that is out there probably isn't in English. And as I mentioned before, there is this kind of tyranny of widely covered narratives where when sources are available in English, there tends to be a lot written about them, or languages that are very English adjacent. such as German. Or is English German adjacent? I don't know. Whatever. So when you get a lot of coverage about either American ships, British ships, or ships that American ships or British ships fought, there's a lot out there. But I mean, even with something like Japan, because a lot of Japanese sources are still in Japanese, you can get quite extensive writings about Japanese ships, and then the handful of people who come along and just go, well, actually, I went over to Japan and looked at the Japanese sources about all of this, outside of the few that have already been translated, and suddenly there's a whole new wealth of information, and you start to see the problem. So I suspect that part of it is there just hasn't been a huge amount written about Estonian submarines. Therefore, that knowledge hasn't really managed to pervade the wider naval history world, especially at least the English-speaking part of it. Farender Ritter asks, in the Royal Navy, how would midshipmen learn all their different specialities, gunnery, carpentry, sails, etc.? Would they shadow the masters or the first mates? Would they rotate through different office posts? Well, bear in mind that a midshipman is an embryonic officer, so as in a commissioned officer. So certain things like carpentry, which are done by non-commissioned officers, they wouldn't necessarily be expected to learn. Gunnery, they would be expected to know in terms of them being gun captains, and of course they could choose to learn more about gunnery to make them better officers. Sails would be a bit more important because, of course, they, as officers, would have to learn how to give the orders to set and furl sails and which types of sail setting are most appropriate for certain weather conditions, etc. But in terms of all of that, it really depends on the time period. In the classic age of sail, when midshipmen generally were signed up directly into ships as, their first stage of learning, then unless they'd been to some kind of private educational establishment, it would very much be learning on the job. So it'd be partly learning from other more experienced midshipmen. Occasionally, if you were lucky, if you were on a ship with multiple lieutenants, which would tend to be the larger ships, then you might learn a bit from them. If you're lucky, the captain might take a personal hand in initial learning and teaching. But a lot of the time, you would be given a mixture of peer learning from your other midshipmen to, who'd been there for a bit longer, and also shadowing various non-commissioned officers who might know a bit more about these kinds of things. But that does get a little bit difficult because technically as a commissioned officer, where your relationship with the non-commissioned officers and the general crew lie can be a little bit dicey. But midshipmen would usually also be expected to complete some form of education aboard the ship, which either the first officer or similar would supervise. Once you move forward to the late age of sail and then well into the 19th century, it gets a little bit easier to deal with because at that point cadets would be trained in training ships and schools ashore, and there they would receive specific classes in a variety of things, including gunnery, sailing, etc., etc. They would go for voyages in training ships, both overseas and locally in harbour. And so then when they were delivered to various actual warships as, full midshipmen, then they would be expected to already know the basics, and they would then pick up the intricacies and the fine details, essentially by learning on the job. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns, asks, I've heard about the British interwar plans to starve the Japanese of trade in the event of a war. What was the expectation for how long until the Japanese would start running out of supplies, especially food? There wasn't a particular expectation of timeline, except for a few general indicators like if the blockade kicked in just before harvest time for that year, then obviously it would be considerably more effective than if the blockade kicked in just after the harvest had been gathered and transshipped. Because obviously if you've got essentially, if put it in RTS game terms, full granaries, then you can ration that out a lot more effectively than if you are expecting to have, your granaries filled up with from relatively empty and suddenly you don't have it. But nonetheless, the British attitude to essentially starvation blockade is a little bit casual to a certain degree. They kind of looked at it from a position of, well, if we can lock them up, then eventually they will run out of money, they will run out of food, they will run out of resources, and they'll be forced to come crawling for peace. And as long as we don't have to actually go in there with troops to accelerate the process, it doesn't really matter too much to us, because if we're locking down their trade, yes, it will cost us money to do with our cruisers and so forth, and in this case submarines. But ultimately, either they come out and fight and then the Royal Navy kills them, or we sit back using cruisers and so forth, and the money that we're losing on running the blockade we'll make back in seized goods and increased dominance of trade. And hey, we've got access to the rest of world trade, so we can definitely outlast them. So pretty much as long as it takes, cup of tea and all that. That was essentially the British attitude to most plans when it came to blockading an opponent, because historically that was what had worked. The costly part of war for Britain has always been the land campaign. If a nation wants to go to war with Britain and Britain can hold it to being almost entirely or entirely a naval conflict, then that's quids in for the UK, because, again, historically speaking, you can sustain the blockade for an awful lot longer with a slightly increased access to global trade than your enemy can sustain their defiance when they don't have any access to global trade. Now, with that said, the Royal Navy did expect the Japanese in particular to come out for battle a bit earlier than when they would begin to starve, but that was based partly on a relatively correct analysis of the fact the Japanese would rather fight than sit in harbour, combined with the Japanese also most likely having to fight in terms of their fleet, because they'd almost certainly run out of fuel oil before they ran out of food. Captain Oblivious asks, since I'm from the US and an English speaker, I've been exposed all my life to the gallant and heroic exploits of the Allied ships of World War II, from the Rawalpindi to Taffy 3 and everything in between. What do you consider the most heroic exploits of Axis ships during World War II? I don't consider Yamato to be heroic as a ship, although the individual sailors certainly were, because it was ordered to do what it did. But feel free to differ. Well, although for obvious reasons I have very harsh things to say about the Allied side of the Laconia incident, the flip side is that the captain and crews of the U-boats and other submarines involved in it, particularly U-156, do stand out, I think, as heroic, because, of course, although theoretically under obligation to do some minimal rescue work, such as saying, well, that way to land, it's this distance, maybe a bit of provisions and so forth, U-boats were not under obligation to conduct extensive help for the survivors of ships they'd sunk. Whereas when U-156 torpedoed the Laconia, now, okay, there was a certain amount of self-interest going on, because the vast majority of those on board the Laconia were Axis prisoners of war, primarily Italians. They still decided to not only surface, but to take as many people aboard the U-boat as possible, and then to tow lifeboats, all of which is above and beyond the call of duty. And then, once they came under attack from American aircraft, U-156 didn't immediately chuck everyone off and say, okay, that's it, we're off by. They did their level best to actually inform the aircraft what was going on, which was actually successful. It's just the aircraft and the commander back at base decided to ignore that. But then once they came under repeated attack, it was only when it became very clear that these attacks stood a decent chance of sending U-156 to the bottom, which would do nobody any favours at that point, that they said, okay, right, look, we've got to look after ourselves now. Sorry, let the lifeboats drift. But even then, the U-156 made certain to submerge slowly so that those on the upper deck could swim away safely rather than being taken down with the sub, all of which was, of course, putting the sub in increased peril of being further attacked by the American aircraft. And as they left, they also said, well, look, we've also signalled for other assistance. There are Vichy French ships coming, so if you all stay here, in theory, they should come and rescue you all. Now, some lifeboats chose to heed that, some didn't. And then, of course, you had 3 other subs, 2 U-boats and an Italian sub that continued to rescue survivors. So they had all gone above and beyond the call of duty, so I think they count as heroic. And I'd say collectively, probably also the Speaker-class torpedo boats, or Spiker, whatever you pronounce it as, which attacked the cruiser Ajax at the Battle of Cape Passero. Because honestly, okay, fair enough, Ajax is not the biggest cruiser on the block. She's a Leander, not a town. But still, if you're in a, well, frankly, tiny little Speaker-class torpedo boat, and, okay, yeah, you got 2 friends with you, but collectively, Ajax still outmasses you 2.5 to 3 times over. Deciding the best thing to do is attack, when, given that it's night, you could easily just slip away and look for better targets elsewhere. That takes a certain amount of determination. Tug Trash 88 asks, USS Slater has a diesel-electric plant for propulsion. How common was this on ships of the era? Most of the museum ships I visited have either been all diesel or all steam. And if it weren't too common, then what were the pros and cons of diesel-electric as opposed to just diesel plants of the time? Diesel-electric plants aren't a very common occurrence. In fact, if you look at it purely by numbers for surface warships, they're almost exclusively found on a few of the US destroyer escort classes, of which, of course, Slater is one. And the original reasoning for having a diesel-electric plant came about because, essentially, power plant shortages, by which, I mean, when they were looking at the original concept for a destroyer escort, they very quickly realized that for them to be built in the numbers that they wanted them to be, geared turbines were not going to be an option because, quite simply, there wasn't enough industrial capacity in the US to build that many gearing sets. Direct drive turbines were incredibly inefficient, and so that left you looking at other options. Now, you could go with a vertical triple expansion engine like you had in the Flower class, or various other unusual types of engine, but with the US, with their destroyer escorts, they did want them to be capable of, a reasonable speed in the low to mid-20s of knots. So those options were out as well. And then someone said, well, what about diesel power plant? We're already making lots of diesel engines for the submarines, so why don't we stick a bunch of those in? And that's what some of the initial destroyer escorts had, just lots of diesels. But then it turned out that if you were going to use up 8 diesel engines for every destroyer escort, suddenly you would now have a shortage of diesel engines as well. And that meant you couldn't build as many destroyer escorts as you wanted or as many submarines as you wanted. And so you then ended up with this diesel-electric solution, which is essentially the diesel-driven version of a turbo-electric drive, except instead of having a boiler and turbine, you have a diesel engine. Now, this does make, technically speaking, the diesel-electric drive a little bit more efficient than a turbo-electric drive, because obviously with a turbo-electric drive, as I said before, you burn fuel to create heat, which creates steam, which creates rotation in the turbines, which is then used to generate electricity, which is then used to generate rotational energy on the propeller shafts via motors, each step of which involves a loss of energy because nothing is 100% efficient. Whereas on a diesel electric engine, you're burning fuel to create rotational motion in a diesel engine, which then goes into creating electricity, which goes into creating rotational motion again, which is less steps and therefore more efficient. The flip side of it, of course, while it saves half the diesels that you would need otherwise, is that it is less efficient than direct drive from diesels, but you get the advantage of, much like with a turbo-electric drive, a very quick and fine response on your propulsion if you want to accelerate or decelerate, which is quite useful for an escort. But in terms of absolute fuel efficiency, given that particularly for an escort ship, the vast majority of its sailing is going to be steady plodding along at a given pace, it would be more fuel efficient just to have pure diesels. But tactically, becomes slightly better when you're hunting submarines, but that's a relatively brief window of operations for a destroyer escort. And obviously, the whole thing's predicated on your power plant being just a bunch of diesels as you would use in a submarine. If you could get fewer larger diesels in there or something like that, then they'd probably prefer to do that instead. So it's a little bit of a wartime kludge because of these equipment shortages. But as it turns out, as long as you're willing to bite the bullet on a bit of efficiency and a little bit of range, it can actually be a very useful feature if your specific job is hunting subs. HMS Implosive asks, when dreadnoughts first were constructed, the standard battle line speed was about 21 knots. Then the Japanese built their battle line for 23 knots, and certain ships like the Queen Elizabeths and Nagato's were even higher. During World War II, 27 to 28 knots was considered the entry-level speed for a modern battleship, with many navies preferring to try and aim for 30 knots or more. My question is, why? Why were battleships required to go faster and faster when their ultimate goal is simply dominance of the seas? It's not like the various land masses are going anywhere, and transport convoys are never going to sail that fast. After all, slower ships therefore would have more displacement for guns and armour, which makes them more likely to win a fair fight, and if the enemy uses their superior speed to refuse battle, then they lose by default. It's often said that battleships needed to be fast to escort their carriers, but to me that feels like a logical failure, as there is no threat that is both fast enough to catch up with a fleet carrier and requires a battleship to gun it down. So what is the big deal with a fast battleship? Well, in theory, you do have battle cruisers which would be fast enough to catch a fleet carrier and require a battleship to deal with. And to a certain extent, potentially also enemy cruisers, because of course you can put your own cruisers in escort, but if you have roughly an equal match in terms of number of enemy cruisers and friendly cruisers, there's a possibility that either your cruisers might lose or one or more enemy cruisers might slip through the line. So there is a certain argument for battleships to be fast enough to escort carriers, at least at cruising speeds. But a lot of the other issues when it comes to speed increasing have to do with, well, there's a few different factors, but one of them is actually just escalation, because even with the pre-dreadnoughts, the average speed was 18 knots. And, well, what I mean by escalation is that if one side decides to put a little bit more towards speed, whether just more machinery space or more advanced machinery, like with Dreadnought going to turbines, then what you get is one side's battle line being 2 or 3 knots faster than the others, and that gives them both the freedom to engage or disengage at will. So if they catch a slower fleet in a favourable position for them, unfavourable position for the slower fleet can't do much, because the faster battle line can force them to accept battle at a time and place of the faster ship's choosing. And equally, if it's an unfair fight, let's say you've got a squadron or two in reinforcement on your way, you can refuse battle long enough to get your reinforcements to come up. And even once battle is joined, if you have the faster battle line, that gives you a number of different advantages, but two of them would be if one of your ships is hit, forcing your battle line to slow, or multiple ships are damaged, you've got a little bit of a reserve where you're still traveling at the same speed as the enemy battle line before you start to drop back. And secondly, related to that, is that as long as your ships are somewhat faster than the enemy's, you can potentially draw ahead of your opponent and start to cross their T, or force them to maneuver to stop you crossing their T, both of which would give you a tactical advantage. Now, of course, as soon as someone does that, other people are going to start trying to match that, and over time, therefore, you get this gradual escalation higher and higher. But there's also the speed of other ships to consider, specifically things like cruisers and destroyers. If your battleships are the slowest ships in your fleet, then your fleet can only advance at a maximum rate commensurate to the speed of your battleships, which again means if outside of actual battle, if someone has a faster battle line, their entire fleet can get places that you can't faster. So if, for example, there's a race to attack a certain position or to defend a certain position, the faster fleet can get there sooner, which means they might be able to attack a place before you can get there to defend it, or they can move to defend it even if they're based further away than you are starting out your attack. which can, again, give them advantages. But on an even larger spectrum, if destroyers and cruisers are, say, doing 33, 35 knots, plus or minus a little bit, and your battleships are only doing 21 knots, then if your battleships are being monitored, harassed, etc., or attacked by destroyers and cruisers, there's not a huge amount they can do about it other than sit there and either take the punishment from torpedo runs or, occasionally lob shells at cruisers, but the cruisers can kite them effectively. Whereas if your ships are capable of doing 27 to 28 knots, or potentially more, then with the speed margin much less, then a destroyer or cruiser that commits to an attack run could potentially be hunted down and killed very easily. And in rough weather, the sheer mass of a battleship might allow it to maintain that top speed or close to it at a time when the lighter cruisers and destroyers, while theoretically having a higher top speed, might have to actually drop back as a result of that weather condition. And therefore, you're actually as fast or faster than the smaller ships, whereas at 21 knots, that won't be the case, which potentially can give you a combat advantage or a defensive advantage. If you're in a 21-knot ship, even in a storm, cruisers and destroyers can hunt you down for a nighttime torpedo attack, say, but in a 27, 28-knot ship, you can outrun them. Or, the flip side, if you come across an outnumbered or outgunned cruiser squadron and they try and run away from you in heavy weather, 27, 28 knots, you can probably catch them. And also, to a very limited degree, there's also the matter of actually the secondary batteries, because you need a certain amount of secondary guns to face off against both small surface ships and for anti-aircraft fire, which means that in theory you're looking at a given minimum space between your fore and aft turrets on a conventional layout. And if you need that minimum space for your secondary battery, that means your hull is going to be of a given length. And, well, if your hull is going to be of that length and your turrets are fixed positions fore and aft, what goes in between? You're going to have to citadel armor that space anyway. You could put in a little bit more fuel, a little bit more ammunition, etc., or you could just put in a bit more machinery, push your speed up, and then you get all the advantages we just discussed. Bill Brockman asks, are there ship types of either World War that were either unsuccessful or unneeded in their intended role, but an unexpected success as another role entirely? Well, there's some low-hanging fruit in the form of things like sloops and destroyers, particularly sloops, because destroyers did have a fairly decent track record in their intended role, but sloops were supposed to be general patrol and gunboats, and it turned out you didn't really need a general slow patrol and gunboat in World War I, but what you did need was an anti-submarine warfare vessel, which no one had really thought about before the war, and suddenly they came up as a really, really good anti-submarine escort. That's a really easy one, though, because that's a role that flat out didn't exist up until the First World War. You could argue in the Second World War, battleships, because yes, there were a few battleship-on-battleship engagements, but ultimately battleships are theoretically supposed to sit down in a line of battle and slug it out with a bunch of others of their own kind, and that very, very rarely happened. But, so, unsuccessful, no, because when the battleships did engage, they turned out to be pretty good at the whole battle line slugging thing, but unneeded, potentially so. They were needed occasionally, but very rarely, but they ended up having quite a lot of success, particularly the Allied ones, as anti-aircraft defense vessels, particularly to defend carriers, because their combination of durability and ridiculous amounts of firepower made them both, obviously, very concentrated fire platforms for putting lots of shells up in the air to take down aircraft, as you can see USS New Jersey doing here, plus having the speed and the range to keep up with carriers for long distances, which cruisers and escorts often couldn't match. But also their sheer durability meant that, combined with their size, they were very often fire magnets for incoming enemy strike aircraft, and they could take the hits. I mean, their firepower made it fairly unlikely they were going to be hit, but if they were hit, they could, to a certain degree, absorb those hits and keep going, which of course drew off large amounts of aircraft and ammunition from the more vulnerable ships like aircraft carriers. So they were pretty successful in that role. I mean, just look at the Battle of Philippine Sea, where they were deliberately positioned forward of the carriers to act as bait, a role that they performed very well, taking down lots of Japanese aircraft and not really sustaining all that much damage themselves. Perhaps one of the best examples is also the Abdeel-class mine layers. Didn't actually end up doing all that much mine laying, did almost everything else, transport runs, acting as a big destroyer, etc., etc. Andrew Dedder asks, looking at results versus action, is there a more boring, important battle than the Battle of the Chesapeake? The action is yet another one of the two lines of ships shot at each other for a few hours. That seems to be pretty much the standard for mid-18th century Age of Reason combat. And exactly one ship is lost, and even that takes a day to sink. Yet the strategic effect is huge. Basically the loss of the British Army at the Siege of Yorktown. Is there any naval battle after Nelson that had such an outsized effect compared to the actual fight? In terms of large-scale combat, where you've got fleets, or let's say for the smaller navies, the majority of fleets' heavy firepower showing up, post-Nelson, I don't think there's anything that quite matches Chesapeake for that kind of massive impact, but relatively minimal actually happening in the battle. Largely because post-Nelson, post-Napoleonic Wars, in the Age of Sail, there's not that many major battles, and you get things obviously like Sinop or Navarino, which are pretty, there's a lot of ships exploding on those. And then once you get into the age of the ironclad and then steel and steam, etc., the destructive power of ships goes up to the point that any kind of major clash usually ends up with somebody or another going home, or rather not going home in a box. Possibly the closest you could say would be maybe Calabria, given that Giulio Cesare just gets a hit on the funnel and goes home. So that's a, relatively speaking, in terms of action, boring action, even if it does give Warspite an incredibly long-range hit. But at the same time, Calabria, although it does have some after effects, doesn't have anywhere near the level of major after effects as the Battle of Chesapeake or the Battle of Virginia Capes, depending on what you want to call it. There are a number of battles involving small craft that potentially could have this kind of impact, but they tend to be actions that you've, relatively speaking, never heard of, and usually you have to chain a bunch of them together as well. So, for example, in various wars in South America in the 19th century, which are very often not very well covered, especially in the English-speaking world, there is, for example, one campaign which I know it off the top of my head. I know it involves Brazil. I can't remember if it's a civil war or a war against somebody nearby, but essentially you end up with essentially gunboats on each side, and there's a whole series of battles which are essentially the same gunboats coming out and shooting at each other for a bit. No one particularly loses a ship for a long time, but then at the end there is a final action where one side gains ascendancy over the other, and that has a whole load of knock-on effects on the conduct of the land campaign. But that's an important outcome, but for the longest time it's just a bunch of gunboats going out having a pop at each other and not a huge amount changing for a while. Lawson Say asks, why wasn't the all-forward layout revisited when designing the King George V class? Could the added efficiency of an all-forward layout have allowed the 12-gun armament to be retained while fitting the desired armour protection and staying within the treaty limits? The all-forward layout was considered in various interwar British battleship designs, and it was considered and discussed for the KGVs. Here's an example of how that might have looked. However, it fell down on a few grounds. Primarily, it had to do with the shape of the stern, because if you look at the KGVs, and indeed with this hull, unlike Vanguard, which had a transom stern, which allowed you to have a wider stern area, they were still looking at a more conventional stern for the KGVs. That meant that a considerable portion of the stern would be quite narrow, and that led to three primary issues. The first of which was that if you wanted a very extensive secondary battery Obviously, if your superstructure is placed further aft, then as your hull begins to narrow, you don't necessarily have the same amount of space to fit a secondary battery as you do in a more conventional layout where the superstructure is amidships. You can see on this design, for example, to maintain an 8-gun broadside, I've had to put a centerline 5.25-inch right aft instead of 4 twins on either side. Obviously, if they'd gone with a transom stern, that would have widened the hull lines out. You might have had a bit more scope on that. Another issue was, again, related to these fine hull lines, was that if you wanted speed, which would require a fairly fine set of hull lines, there was a concern that perhaps the hull would start narrowing before you could fit all the machinery that you wanted to in. And all of this was compounded by the need for aircraft, because one thing you might be able to tell immediately upon looking at this design is that, well, if I moved the aft superstructure so that it butted up against the forward superstructure, that would move the so that aft section of superstructure forward enough that I could probably get a more conventional layout of secondary guns either side of the superstructure. And that would be true, but remember, the British at this point, they like their amidships, or near enough amidships, aircraft launching and handling and hangar facilities. They're not really fans of the US-style stern-mounted aircraft. Now, you could make an argument, therefore, that it would be possible for the Royal Navy to do a all-forward KGV design if they went with a transom stern, like Vanguard would eventually have, and either abandoned aircraft or went for a stern-mounted aircraft handling facility. That would still allow you to have enough space either side while the hull is still quite wide to fit a decent secondary battery, still have your aircraft, and by moving the superstructure forward and the funnels forward, you'd probably, and having a transom stern, you'd also have a wider aft hull section, which would give you more space for machinery. So that would address pretty much all the concerns. And the interesting thing is that with the aid of forced circulation boilers, the French managed exactly that kind of thing with the Richelieu, and they didn't need to use a transom stern because they just had the aircraft handling facilities further aft, albeit they only had 2 quad turrets up front. But when you look at the spacing of those 2 quad turrets, you realise that, well, with the existing Richelieu layout, fair enough, you probably couldn't fit 3 all forward. But given that they still have a big conning tower, if you have the British approach of not having that conning tower and you shuffle things around a bit, you probably could get 3 quad 15s forward for a Richelieu design, or 3 quad 14s for a British design like here. So, in short, they did consider it, but because of various other considerations that the British set in stone when it came to designing their capital ships, it meant the all-forward layout couldn't quite be made to work. But, as I just pointed out, there were some things which, if they had changed, could have made the thing work. And in fact, to be perfectly honest, I think even without some of those changes, they could have made it work if they really wanted to. PH5817 says, combined with Robert Henry Ilston's question on what was the first warship to receive an electrical generator, when do you consider the use of electricity on warships to be mature, as in used for ventilation, lighting, turret movement, etc.? Well, as I've mentioned previously, as far as I'm aware, the first major warship to have an electrical generator for proper at-sea uses was the Inflexible, as seen here. In terms of when do I consider it to be a mature technology, that depends very much on your criteria and Navy. For example, with what you say, ventilation, lighting, and turret movement, if you want to include full turret rotation purely driven by electricity, it's quite a considerable gap. The French have electrically driven turrets in the middle of the pre-dreadnought period. The British are still causing gigantic Tesla coils in their attempts, even by the early dreadnought period. So you could argue that, in that case, the Marine Nationale had mature electrical technology on their ships in the 1890s, whereas the British still were struggling with it in the 1910s. But that's only if you include full electric turret control and movement. If you consider more basic stuff, like I said, ventilation, lighting, pumping, and not zapping and killing people at random, like some of the measures on the Inflexible, then you could argue that potentially electricity was a mature technology on warships easily by the early to mid 1880s, as in it was safe, it had a lot of different uses, and, well, relatively safe, and could be expanded upon. But depending on what you add on to that in terms of load capacity and additional uses, you can extend that timeline further and further forward. R.J. Blaine asks, my husband asks the following: how effective were armour belts once battle ranges increased? It feels like at reasonable battle ranges, the odds of hitting the belt versus the odds of the shell falling above it and hitting the armoured deck would increase. Would the opposite side armour belt keep the shell from punching straight through and just ruin your day by potentially causing it to detonate inside? So with the last bit, would an armour belt keep a shell from punching straight through and then make it explode inside? Not really, because if you have an armour-piercing shell that either gets through belt armour or gets through the side, it's going to hit enough things on the way through to cause it to detonate, assuming it hits a relatively wide portion of the ship. The bow, yeah, sure, it might go through and through, but the bow's not usually armoured anyway. And even if you're dropping in from above, there's still the superstructure getting in the way. So you're not going to get a situation where an armour belt on the opposite side of the ship is going to do bad things to you, where the shell might otherwise have just passed through. Now, when it comes to the deck versus the belt, it is an interesting question, to be sure, because if we take, for example, here a King George V, so I've taken a half profile and doubled it up. If we take just the height above the water for its armour belt as our initial indicator, now obviously the belt is deeper, but obviously at zero angle a shell would skip off the waterline. But so this isn't a perfect analogy, is what I'm saying, because in theory the amount of depth that the belt should be covering should be more. So we're being quite conservative, quite in favour of deck armour here, but let's go with it. So this reflects an angle of about 8 or 9 degrees, and this reflects an angle of 16 degrees. So what you're seeing is at about 8 degrees, so for typical World War II guns, you're talking about a range of about 12,000 yards. There is, assuming that you're broadside on, a roughly 50-50 chance of hitting belt armour or deck armour if you actually hit the ship. At 16 degrees, which for, again, typical World War II warships, you're looking at a range of 21 to 23,000 yards, give or take, but for most guns, then you're looking at roughly a 2/3 chance of hitting the deck versus hitting the belt. So you might think, well, clearly it's much more important to have deck armour as opposed to belt armour. But you have to bear in mind a few things. Firstly, even at 20 to 22 or 23,000 yards, the odds of actually hitting something are quite low, even for late World War II era fire control. So you can have battles, certainly at long ranges, but the chances of actually hitting anything are relatively small. You probably want to get a bit closer, and as you get closer, the odds of hitting the belt rather than the deck start to go up. Now, granted, for this kind of armour layout, most gun battles between battleships are going to happen between the two values we've looked at, so you're looking at somewhere between 50-50 and 2/3, 1/3 in favour of hitting deck armour rather than belt. But then you come to another issue. Look at these blocks. So these blocks are, all equal, angled at 16 degrees. If the shell is in the right-handmost block and it hits the deck, assuming it penetrates the deck, what's it going to hit? Nothing much of great importance, to be perfectly honest, and lessen until it fetches up against the other side of the ship. If it's in the middle block, so it's hitting on the engaged side of the ship on the deck, again, follow that trajectory down. There is a small chance of that trajectory at the lower end of things clipping into the upper part of the magazines or the very upper part of the machinery spaces, but it is relatively unlikely. The majority of that, again, is going to explode somewhere higher up in the ship. But then you look at the trajectory where it's hitting the belt armour, and that's drawing a line straight into the machinery rooms or the magazines, whichever part of the ship it's adjacent to. So although deck penetrations, even at 23,000 yards, have or deck hits, should we say, have a greater chance of happening, they still have a relatively small chance of hitting something vital. Now, of course, they could explode high in the ship, and if there's not enough protection, if they penetrate the deck armour, then splinters could go further down, but that's less lethal than an actual shell ending up there, which is what happens if it would go through the belt armour. And essentially what this is pointing to is that in every range instant case, a belt penetration or a penetration through the side has either the potential or near enough a guarantee, if it gets through the side, to go down into something really vital, machinery or magazine-wise. Whereas with deck hits, realistically, you have to go out quite a distance to, at least with this kind of all-or-nothing armour scheme, to actually get to a position where a deck penetrating hit could continue on down straight into somewhere vital, and even at that range, a penetrating hit to the belt armour will still do exactly the same, and at those extreme ranges, the chances of you scoring a hit are pretty low. So while statistically, at reasonable battle ranges, once they've gone up, aka World War II type of battle ranges, statistically a belt armour hit is somewhat less likely than a deck armour hit. The belt armour is, at pretty much all ranges, protecting you from an absolutely vital hit. Deck armour is only protecting you from a truly catastrophic vital hit at the more extreme end of even World War II battle ranges. And finally, for this half of the sequence, Kra F1 asks, are there any occurrences of ships running out of fuel completely? I've never heard of any, so is this as rare as it seems, or has it happened but not caused the loss of a ship? For a steam and steel warship, how serious was running out of fuel, and how would a navy deal with that? It's exceptionally rare in the age of steam and steel, but it did happen. Back in the ironclad era, it was a lot more common, but that was because with auxiliary engines, essentially, there was a lot less fuel aboard, and the engines weren't anywhere near as efficient. Plus, of course, at that point, ships had full sets of sails, so if they essentially ran out of fuel, it was just like, who cares? That's what we have sails for. But even so, it's not brilliant. But in the 20th century, there are a few cases. So, for example, this is the USS R-14. She was on a search mission at one point when she actually ran out of fuel. And, she had to hoist sails and sail on home, which was a rather interesting experience, I'm sure, for submarines crew who obviously don't have a mast to hang the sails from in the first place, but periscopes come in handy, it turns out. And obviously didn't have sails either, so they had to make them out of bed sheets. She's not the only submarine to have had to sail home literally, but I think she's the only one who had to sail home just because she ran out of fuel. There are a few others that have either lost power for other reasons or have had their fuel forcibly removed from them through battle damage, who have also had to briefly make a go of it under sails, or their engines have packed up or something. And it also wasn't entirely unheard of in some of the convoy escorts in World War II. There are quite a few records of corvettes being detached, or ships of that nature being detached because they were low on fuel. And although rare, it wasn't unheard of for some escorts to be entering harbour, being towed by other escorts who were also quite low on fuel, but not quite that low, because the one being towed had actually run out of fuel. Now, usually what this meant wasn't that they had literally zero oil in their tanks, although sometimes this was actually the case, but most of the time what it would mean was that they'd run so low on oil that for the amount of distance they still had to cover, they would have to creep along at 2, 3, 4 knots to make it, which would be hilariously unsafe, at which point they'd be taken under tow, and as I say, occasionally they might actually run out. But what it would mean is that usually what minimal amount of fuel was left could be used to keep generators running or to keep an engine ticking over at the absolute minimum, so that things like light and the pumps could be kept running, rather than the ship either, say, creeping along very, very slowly and being at risk of being torpedoed or hit by from air attacks, or running out of fuel completely and utterly, at which point most ships would be completely out of power. And yes, you might have emergency generators on board, but for one thing, you might have tried burning that fuel as well before you ran completely cold, and for two, You really don't want to keep an entire ship running for any significant length of time on purely emergency generators alone. You'll burn them out pretty quickly. And well, that's the end of part 1. Join us in a few minutes over in part 2.